Part 4, Building Team Pronglet, The Ganging Up on Dumbledore Prank. The 4th of July, 1994. Augusta Longbottom was a formidable woman. Scary was the word Remus had used when he'd wished Sirius well as Sirius had headed out of Griffin House that morning. Harry had just laughed at him and told him to convey his greetings to Neville. He smiled as he remembered the homely scene of lunch. He and Harry had been thrilled to be reunited with Remus and even more thrilled to hear how Remus had sent Dumbledore off to Thailand. Sirius was certain that Augusta was keeping him waiting in her parlor just to see him squirm. He smoothed his formal black robe with its neat column of tiny black buttons that ran from the high stiff collar to his waist and had taken forever to do up. The crests of the House of Black and House of Potter decorated the front right breast. His robes opened up at his waist, angling away to give him freedom to move, and he had opted for muggle black leather trousers underneath, expensive but serviceable and very protective as he knew from riding his motorbike. Expensive dragon hide boots completed the outfit. He fidgeted with the wide cuffs of his robes which provided easy access to his wand. Harry had done the inheritance ritual for the House of Potter that morning at Gringotts. The family magic had immediately formed into the approving gold griffin totem, and the head of house ring had leaped onto Harry's finger. It had granted Harry access into the Potter vault and had removed some of the effects of the Death Fidelius so they could access Potter family assets. Harry had been thrilled at getting to look at some of his heritage and had pounced on his father's old school trunk. Sirius had a suspicion that Harry was after James's animagus journals. A noise from just outside the doorway had Sirius rising, just in time for Augusta to enter. Her grey hair was tightly bound in a high bun, her aged face stern and foreboding. She wore formal robes in a deep purple decorated with the House of Longbottom crest. They were high-necked but narrow-cuffed and looked more uncomfortable than his own. He bowed and took her outstretched hand, dropping a kiss onto her knuckles before rising and meeting her eyes firmly. He definitely needed his Gryffindor courage, Sirius considered with a silent laugh. "Madam Longbottom, thank you for agreeing to meet with me," Sirius said sincerely. Augusta motioned for him to sit and took the seat opposite, her eyes running over the two crests on his robe and the ring on his finger with sharp realization. "May I offer you some refreshment, Lord Black?" "Only if you wish to partake yourself," Sirius replied, following the formal dance of pleasantries. Augusta rang a small silver bell and a house elf popped in. "Some tea and biscuits for myself and my guest." The elf disappeared and a moment later a tea tray appeared on the small table between them. For a few minutes all that was exchanged was how Sirius liked his tea. "Forgive me for speaking plainly, but I'm surprised at the ring," Augusta said as they settled back, each holding a matching china teacup. "There are rumors circulating of a new Lord Black, but the general opinion is that it isn't you." "A situation which suits me for the time being," Sirius admitted. "I'd like to have my ducks in a row before the formal announcement at Thursday's Wizengamot." He took a sip of his tea and set it aside. "I would appreciate your discretion until that time." She inclined her head. "I find myself needing to clarify, are you here for the House of Potter or the House of Black?" "I would like us to speak first regarding business between the House of Potter and House of Longbottom. But afterwards, I would appreciate the regent of the House of Longbottom granting an audience to the head of the House of Black." "Granted," Augusta said tersely. "So, to business. Lord Potter sends his regards to you and the heir to the House of Longbottom. He has only recently become aware of his heritage and the alliance that used to exist between the houses," Sirius said formally. "We seek a renewal of that alliance." Augusta's pale eyes sparkled with interest. "Well, that answers a number of questions. I suppose Dumbledore didn't tell the boy of his responsibilities?" Sirius nodded. "In fairness, it wasn't his legal responsibility to do so, although some could argue it would fall under his chief warlock duties," he said diplomatically. He held his tongue that one of the other ancient and noble families could have stepped in, such as the Longbottoms, who'd had such a strong alliance with the Potters in the past. "What agenda will the House of Potter assume under its new lord?" "Respect of wizarding culture and tradition," Sirius began, "but equality for all wizards and witches, including those with a dual heritage or condition such as lycanthropy. He would seek better relationships with magical races, a common-sense approach to the control of magical creatures, and an improved relationship with the Muggle government." "That sounds remarkably like Charles Potter's old agenda," Augusta said slowly. just even more ambitious. Sirius allowed himself a small smile. Harry reminds me of Charles. He's a remarkable young man. This is truly his agenda. Augusta probed. He's had something of a crash course in politics, but this is his agenda. Sirius confirmed. He'd been proud of Harry after their last lesson, which had been to determine Harry's point of view on certain critical political points. Harry was very much an egalitarian with a strong sense of justice. Well, our agendas mesh, although the devil is always in the detail. Augusta frowned. I assume the equality statement is a rejection of pure-blood supremacy, but why equality for all wizards and witches? Why differentiate? Harry feels witches should have equal rights with wizards. As it stands, most of the Wizengamot seats, the ancient and noble houses in particular, all follow a patriarchal inheritance rule. The eldest male of the line inherits, females only inherit when there isn't a male candidate. Harry believes that it should be the eldest child, thus witches would have equal rights to inherit. Sirius shifted. Family magic will accept a female, so there shouldn't be an issue. Augusta gave a small smile. I remember conversations with Doria and Minerva in my youth where we said very much the same thing. This notion of dual heritage and conditions, what's that about? Our steward Remus Lupin is infected with lycanthropy. Harry has seen the discrimination against him and disagrees with it. From his perspective, Remus is still foremost a wizard and should receive help to aid him in controlling the lycanthropy through Wolfsbane rather than being shunned. An interesting perspective, and one Frank would have agreed with. I believe he knew Lupin. Augusta commented. Yes, through James. Sirius said. We also talked a little about the discrimination against those wizards and witches with velar inheritance or giant or goblin in their family makeup. Harry sees this as just another expression of the same pure-blood supremacy bias against half-bloods and muggleborns. I can't disagree with that either. Augusta murmured. She tapped her fingers lightly against the arm of her chair. What of the rest of his agenda? Harry believes that we should attempt better relationships with other magical races such as giants, centaurs, house elves and goblins, especially those races which interact with wizards on a regular basis. But he recognizes the need for good but caring control of dragons, hippogriffs and other magical creatures. He believes the current administration often gets magical races and creatures mixed up. He also believes that a better relationship with the Muggle government would be beneficial in upholding the statute of secrecy. For a crash course in politics, he's done well. His agenda dovetails with ours. Augusta said after a long moment of consideration. So, in principle the House of Longbottom will be happy to renew our alliance. What are the terms? Formally, the same terms as the houses have pledged before, mutual aid and support for common goals. I would appreciate your assistance in repairing the other Potter alliances that have been allowed to go dormant since '81. Sirius replied immediately, happy that he'd gotten to the in-principle discussion so early. Informally, Harry would like your permission to foster a closer relationship with Neville, perhaps by having Neville join him for some of his lessons this summer. Harry didn't realize until I was awarded guardianship that Alice was his godmother, nor that James and Lily were Neville's godparents. You know, Albus Dumbledore has a lot to answer for with that young man. Augusta sighed. I couldn't agree with you more. Sirius said fervently. Augusta regarded him thoughtfully. Will the House of Potter not seek an alliance with the Chief Warlock? The House of Potter will stand for itself. Sirius stated unequivocally. The last alliance was uneven at best, and subjugated the House of Potter to Dumbledore's agenda at worst. I think some of that was our youth. James was very loyal and used to Dumbledore being in a position of authority over him as headmaster and leader of the order we all were. Yes, Augusta agreed with a heavy sigh. Frank was similarly affected. However, I'm aware that the Chief Warlock is mostly supportive of the House of Potter's agenda. I won't in principle disregard a possible alliance approach if one is made, but as regent I won't approve an alliance without further oaths from the Chief Warlock that ensure the House of Potter's independence. Augusta considered him for a long enough moment that Sirius had to struggle not to fidget. I can see why Archerus left you as his heir. As much as I might have despised his agenda, his skill in navigating the political arena was immense. You seem to have inherited it. The words took Sirius's breath away. He was unsure if he'd been complimented or insulted. The House of Longbottom finds your terms acceptable. She drew her wand and tapped the coffee table. A ritual bowl appeared with a small knife. She slashed her finger and let a couple of drops of blood fall. I, Augusta Beatrice Longbottom, swear as regent that the House of Longbottom renews its pledge of alliance to give mutual aid and support to the House of Potter. So have I sworn, so mote it be. Sirius took the knife she offered and allowed his blood to mingle with hers. I, Sirius Orion Black, swear as regent that the House of Potter renews its pledge of alliance to give mutual aid and support to the House of Longbottom. So have I sworn, so mote it be. The bowl flashed, a gold griffin and bear appeared briefly before disappearing again. Augusta gave a small sigh. Well, that's done. I'll expect a schedule of lessons so I can select which Neville will attend. Agreed. As part of our formal agreement, there are things that I need to brief you on immediately. Sirius said, picking up his tea. He explained about Voldemort still being alive in some form, about the Horcruxes in very vague terms, and finally, the events at Hogwarts with Peter's escape and the prophecy Harry had heard. What's the plan to deal with this? Augusta said. There was anger in her eyes and a rush of red across her cheeks. She was furious. I'll be informing the authorities tomorrow. We're not really sure how much Dumbledore has shared with the DMLE and the Dom. Then we'll work with them to eliminate the things that keep Voldemort alive. Sirius paused. We believe there may be another prophecy at work, one involving Harry and Voldemort. Augusta winced. There is. She sighed and looked every year of her age for a second. Frank told me about it before they went into hiding. It could have been Neville, you see. We surmised as much. Sirius noted. The prophecy was given by Sybil Trelawney to Albus Dumbledore during her job interview, the year the boys were born. Augusta shared. It spoke of a baby with the power to vanquish the Dark Lord, born as the seventh month, died to parents who had thrice defied the Dark Lord. Frank said there was more to it, but that was all I was told. She looked at him sharply. I would venture that Albus believes it refers to your godson rather than my grandson, as he once informed me that the danger to my family was over, as though that were comfort for what happened to Frank and Alice. Sirius held his tongue. He needed to cover the Lestranges when he spoke with Augusta as the head of the House of Black. Augusta frowned. Well, at least, we know and have a plan. She settled back in her chair, although her back was ramrod straight. Thank you for this information. Thank you for sharing what you know of the prophecy. Sirius said. It'll make it easier for Harry and I to track down in the Dom. He clasped his hands together. My final piece of business on behalf of the House of Potter is to extend an invitation to yourself and the heir to the House of Longbottom to attend Lord Potter's adoption into the House of Black the day after tomorrow. Augusta's eyebrows rose in surprise. She pressed her lips together. This seems like an opportune moment for us to move to the audience I granted you earlier, Lord Black. Sirius nodded. Yes. He took a deep breath. My house has wronged yours. Bellatrix Lestrange is my cousin, Rodolphus is my cousin's husband. The House of Black has primacy in their marriage contract, their line falls under mine. I cannot take back what they did, but I wish to offer restitution. A muscle twitched along her jawline and her gaze turned steely. And what would the House of Black offer as restitution to the House of Longbottom for the loss of its lord and lady, for the damage to its heir? On Wednesday, I will hold a family meeting. In absentia, I will name them all oath-breakers to the House of Black in their act of taking the Dark Mark and call upon the family magic to render judgment. They will lose their magic. He stopped for a moment to let Augusta absorb his words. Judgment. Augusta repeated. It's been a long while since I've seen family magic invoked in such a way. I will also dissolve the marriage contract between the House of Black and the House of Lestrange and seize the Lestrange vault in compensation. The heirlooms and artifacts will be retained, but all else will be given over to the House of Longbottom to cover the healing expenses pertaining to Frank and Alice. Bella will then be cast out of the House of Black. She gave a sharp nod of acknowledgement. I also propose to assume financial responsibility for the heir of Longbottom's education. I will provide a scholarship vault to that end to cover the forthcoming years, including a mastery if Neville wishes to pursue one. The House of Longbottom will be reimbursed for the last 3 years. Sirius continued. Augusta's lips thinned as she pressed them tightly together. I accept the House of Black's restitution. As of this morning, the House of Black is formally allied with the House of Potter, Sirius said quietly. He and Harry had exchanged oaths after Harry's inheritance ritual. One day I hope that we will be able to ally with the House of Longbottom. One day Augusta agreed, but not today. We will, however, be honored to attend the adoption in support of Lord Potter. She got to her feet and Sirius knew the audience was over. He got to his feet and bowed. Our elf will show you back to the flue, Augusta said, holding out her hand as the elf popped in. Thank you for coming. Thank you for having me, Sirius returned, kissing her knuckles in farewell. He breathed a sigh of relief as Augusta swept from the room. He followed the elf out and checked the time. He was right on schedule, it was almost time for dinner with the Grangers. Oh. Hedwig barked as Harry banked sharply on his broom and surveyed the house and grounds again. His new home was great, warm and welcoming. It wasn't as formal Black Manor, which was a relief, and he loved the sign with pronglet on the door of his bedroom, the photos on the mantelpiece of his mum and dad, the Marauders, without Peter, and a few snapshots of him, Sirius and Remus. Dobby had been a huge surprise, but so long as the elf wasn't actively trying to save Harry's life, he was a good elf, and he couldn't do enough for Harry. It was odd though not having chores to do. But Sirius had indicated that once the week was over Harry would be getting culture and etiquette lessons to go along with the magical and political lessons he already did, and Sirius had made it clear that he expected Harry to start to perform duties associated with the House of Potter. So Harry would be going with Remus to follow up on some of the Potter properties, and be actively involved with the scholarship set up in his mother's name. The good news was that Sirius hoped to offer the lessons where appropriate to some of Harry's friends so he wouldn't face it all alone. Harry had queried the ability to use magic as he was underage, but Sirius had told him they'd apply for an exception on medical grounds, and besides, the Ministry would never trace magic performed under the Fidelius. Hedwig flew around him and he wasn't surprised when he saw Reg join her. The resplendent black owl for the House of Black was rather taken with Hedwig, who ignored him. Dobby had constructed an owlery next to Remus's attic room for the three owls in the house, but Hedwig preferred her perch in Harry's room. Harry mused that it was useful having different owls for different purposes. Hooter was very nondescript and he understood the need for secrecy. He thought it was hilarious that Dumbledore was apparently in Thailand trying to track down Sirius. He would feel sorry for Dumbledore, but he suspected that if his headmaster knew where Harry was, he would try and send him back to the Dursleys. Sirius and Remus were determined that it wasn't going to happen. Harry frowned as he pushed the broom into flight again. He was looking forward to seeing Hermione and Ron. He already missed Kimmy and Hewrit. He couldn't wait to tell Hermione and Ron about them, but he had to wait for normal time to catch up with the time he'd spent in the bubble before he could write to them. A shout from below caught his attention and he looked down. He waved to Remus, who had come out of the back door and was gesturing that his time was up. He ignored the faint tug of disappointment and dived to the ground, Hedwig and Reg following him. Remus looked a little pale when Harry dismounted. "Do you have to dive so fast?" "I dive faster during Quidditch," Harry pointed out. "Don't remind me," Remus retorted, ruffling his hair as he nudged him inside. "I'm likely to have a heart attack watching one of your games." Harry grinned at him. Remus and Sirius had told him of their plan to attend his matches and he couldn't help feel a warm glow that they would. "Shower and change into Muggle clothes. Don't forget you have dinner with the Grangers," Remus instructed. "Thanks for organizing it, Remus," Harry said sincerely. Remus had set up a lot of things in the week that he and Sirius had been gone in real time. Remus smiled at him and pushed him in the direction of the narrow back stairs in the kitchen that led to the upper floors. Harry had to admit as he ran up them and entered his room that the time difference was still a little disconcerting. He and Sirius had been in the valley for 2 months while a week had passed for Remus. It was bizarre to think that the summer holiday was still only just nearly 2 weeks old, with most of July and August still stretched out ahead of them. Harry dumped his dirty clothing into the linen basket in the bathroom and climbed into the shower, running it nice and hot. He loved his new room and he had his own bathroom. No sharing with the Dursleys. He luxuriated in the hot water, knowing he could spend the time under the spray and wouldn't be chased out. Well, not immediately. He was fairly certain Remus or Sirius, or worse Dobby, would yank him out if he was going to be late for dinner. The thought spurred him into action and he set about washing off the sweat and dirt from his flight. Harry knew the next few days were going to be busy. Sirius had explained that they had a lot of political alliances to fix and protection to put in place before Dumbledore returned to chair the session of the Wizengamot where Sirius would take his place as Lord Black and Regent of the House of Potter. Harry considered that as he stopped the water and grabbed a warm fluffy towel to dry off. Part of their preparations had been Harry performing the Potter inheritance ritual that morning and allying formally with the House of Black. The ritual had been fascinating. They'd gone to Gringotts early to avoid the crowds and been shown to a private room. The goblins had brought in the ritual bowl but Sirius insisted they use his knife. The cut across his palm had been momentarily painful but no big deal. The feel of his family magic though that had been such a rush and the gold griffin that had appeared had been majestic as it bowed to him. Sirius had explained that family magic was usually used to bind oaths and in extreme circumstances for judgment. The oaths taken by ancient and noble houses were governed by the family magic. Oaths in general, Sirius had informed him, were not worth very much, they were mainly another way of forming a verbal contract, and like most verbal contracts they were unenforceable in law. However, if someone took a ritual oath with an ancient and noble house they became subject to its family magic and if they broke oath, the magic could be called upon by the head of the house to judge them. Unsurprisingly, most members of ancient and noble houses took it as a matter of honor to uphold the oaths they made. Harry liked the idea of the oaths. He had felt proud making his own oath as head of house and making the alliance with Sirius. It had changed his view of the politics lessons a bit. He realized that he really did need to know about the kind of stuff Sirius had been teaching him. Moreover, he wanted to be included in deciding who to ally with, what his house stood for. He'd been thrilled when Sirius had told him his agenda sounded very much like his grandfather's and he was looking forward to assuming some of his duties. The scholarship sounded brilliant, something his mum had wanted to give back to Hogwarts, and he was excited at being involved in selecting who would get it. He was a little nervous about working with Professor McGonagall and Professor Flitwick on it, but Remus had pointed out that both professors had known Harry's parents well and might take the opportunity to tell him some stories. He'd wondered briefly out loud why they hadn't told him while he was at Hogwarts, but Remus had explained that it was difficult because the professors weren't supposed to have favorites or have personal relationships with their students. Remus had even had to promise Dumbledore not to tell Harry how friendly he had been with Harry's father. Harry stopped in front of his wardrobe and sighed. He loved that Sirius and Remus had gone to so much trouble to buy him new wizarding and muggle clothes, but the sheer volume and variety always drew him. He picked out an emerald t-shirt that he'd worn a lot in the States and a new pair of black denim jeans. He finished his outfit with a black and grey sweater jacket and black trainers. He slipped his new pair of gold wire-framed glasses on his face and futilely tried to do something with his hair before he gave it up as a lost cause. He picked up his journal and a book he'd bought Hermione at the airport as a present, and exited his room just in time to meet Sirius coming out of his. His godfather wore a white t-shirt over a pair of blue denim jeans and a smart black leather blazer. His dark hair was tied back in a ponytail with a no-nonsense black band. He carried a black leather satchel and he opened it up so Harry could pop the journal and present inside. "Looking good," Sirius said, taking in Harry in one glance. "I've noticed you like that t-shirt." His grey eyes took on a hint of mischief. "It wouldn't have anything to do with me telling you that it brought out the green in your eyes." Harry made a non-committal noise and refused to blush. "You said smart but casual, right? And what was that smart but casual? As though someone could base an outfit on such a vague description." "Indeed I did." Sirius nudged him towards the stairs. "How did it go today?" Harry asked eagerly. "The House of Potter is once again allied with the House of Longbottom. They are attending the adoption." He made a small grimace, his face contorting for a moment into an unhappy frown. "She's accepted the restitution the House of Black has offered but won't consider an alliance right now." "You expected that though?" Harry pointed out. "I did," Sirius said. "Elmer Sampson sends his regards and appreciation of your thanks for his service as your former proxy." Harry pulled a face at that. He'd understood the need for the nicety, but he and Sirius had looked over Sampson's record and been distinctly unimpressed. Samson had voted for a number of laws that Sirius had confirmed Harry's father and grandfather would never have supported, including the werewolf laws that so discriminated against Remus. Harry took the last 2 stairs at a leap to avoid talking more about Samson. Remus came out of the living room into the hallway just as Harry landed in the hallway. "No jumping," he chided him, and then sighed as he realized Sirius had copied Harry. Harry hid his smile. "Are you sure you don't want to come, Remus? I'm sure Hermione wouldn't mind." "Thank you, Harry, but I have other plans," Remus said with a smile. "Give Hermione my best though." Harry grinned at him. Sirius pushed him towards the flue. They made their way to Black Manor before taking the flue to Hermione's house, which had been connected just for the night. Harry stumbled out into a normal Muggle house, not unlike the one he'd been raised in, but with an indefinable welcoming feel that Privet Drive lacked. Harry just had enough time to stand properly before Hermione launched herself at him, hugging him hard. "It's so good to see you. I was so surprised when Professor Lupin wrote to my parents and asked if it would be okay for you and Sirius to come over. Have you been reading The Prophet? They've been talking about Sirius all of last week and this week, and everyone's wondering when they are going to see you and Sirius and—" "Breathe, Hermione," Harry ordered, laughing. She stumbled back and smiled at him. Her hair was its usual bushy self, a mass of brown that seemed bigger than her, although he noticed absently that Hermione was growing more and more into it as time went on. She was just as cute as Kimmy, Harry realized with surprise, as he took in her denim skirt and summery top, so much more flattering than the school robes. "You look nice," Hermione said shyly, and he belatedly realized that she had performed a review of him while he had been doing a review of her. "You too," Harry said. He turned around just as Sirius stepped out. Sirius smirked at Harry and waved his wand over him. Soot vanished from Harry and Hermione. "We need to add flue lessons to your schedule. I can't wait till we learn how to apparate," Harry said. He looked at his godfather hopefully. "I don't suppose." "No, I am a responsible adult and you will be learning to apparate in your 6th year and not a moment before," Sirius said primly. Hermione gave a quiet laugh beside Harry. "It's good to see you again, Mr. Black." "Sirius, please," Sirius replied, taking Hermione's outstretched hand and dropping a kiss on her knuckles. "Or Padfoot, if you'd prefer." A throat being cleared by the door had them all turning to look at an older and amused-looking version of Hermione. "Mum," Hermione waved her hand at Harry and Sirius. "This is Harry and Sirius Black. This is my mum." Hermione's mum, otherwise known as Miriam Granger. She crossed the room and stuck her hand out in a no-nonsense way that reminded Harry of Hermione herself. "Mrs. Granger." Harry followed Sirius's example with Hermione and kissed the back of her knuckles, surprising the older woman. Sirius did the same. "Please call me Sirius. And I'm Miriam." Miriam's gaze raked over them both. "Well, it's good to have you both here. Come through. It's a nice day, so Wallace thought any excuse for a barbecue." She led them through a narrow corridor and into a large family kitchen which opened up onto a wide patio and substantial garden. There was another round of introductions. Sirius accepted a beer from a cool box to the side of where Wallace had set up the smoking grill, and Harry stuck with unsweetened lemonade on the picnic table, which was also laden with summer salads. The drink was tart but refreshing, and he'd learned his lesson about alcohol. Miriam coaxed her husband away from the grill and they all adjourned to the table. "I have to admit that I was a little surprised when we got the request for a meeting, Sirius." Miriam smiled at him warmly. "According to that magical newspaper Hermione gets, everyone thinks you're abroad." "Deliberate misdirection on the part of myself and my advisors," Sirius confirmed. He nudged Harry's shoulder with his own. "We wanted to make sure my getting custody of this one went off without a hitch. Unfortunately, there are too many people out there who would have loved to have interfered, since Harry is famous in the wizarding world, and after the events surrounding me." He gave a shrug. "Understandable," Wallace said. "And, congratulations." "Thank you," Harry said, beaming at Sirius again. "I believe you had something to talk to us about," Miriam prompted. Professor Lupin was quite vague, but he mentioned something about a life debt. Hermione has already done some research and she tells us that they are quite important in the wizarding world. Harry was unsurprised. He turned to Hermione. So what did you find out? Well, just what Mum said really. Hermione admitted with some chagrin. There wasn't a great deal of information in the books I have and I haven't had time to get to Diagon Alley to find something more relevant. Maybe I should explain more. Sirius offered easily. Everyone nodded and Harry was amused to realize that all three Grangers had identical looks of fascination, curiosity and anticipation. Hermione was almost vibrating in her seat opposite him. Historically, life debts had much more importance than they do now. Sirius began. It used to be that if one wizard saved the life of another that the rescued wizard would have to remain beside their rescuer until they had returned the favor. That went out of fashion around the time the ancient and noble houses were formed. Harry shifted, a tad bored because he'd heard it before. It then became a matter of honor for the houses. Sirius explained. If a member of one house saved the member of another, it created a political debt between them that could only be satisfied with an alliance or an exchange of money or property of some sort, usually negotiated dependent on the relative value of the person saved. If you saved the youngest daughter, for instance, that would be viewed differently than saving the heir to the house or the head of house. The former might be offered in marriage, for instance, but the latter might determine a house alliance. It all sounds very Victorian, or do I mean Edwardian? Miriam commented. Austenish anyway. Sirius smiled at her. If you mean old-fashioned, you'd be right. It is even for the wizarding world. What about if you weren't from a house? Hermione jumped in enthusiastically. What happens then? Well. If a member of a house saved the life of an ordinary wizard or witch, then the ordinary wizard or witch would become beholden to them to a degree and would pay off the debt by working on the estates of the house or performing other services for the house. Sirius said. Equally, if it was the other way around, the house became responsible for the ordinary wizard or witch and would ensure employment and safety. They gained the protection and sanctuary of a house. Is it a magical bond? Hermione immediately moved to her next question. No, Sirius laughed. Magical bonds of any kind are very rare and the most common are between wizards, or witches, and their familiars. There are twin bonds, but beyond that no. An oath might be taken as part of the life debt payment. He motioned with his beer bottle. Equally, if an oath was already in existence, incurring a life debt may make the person involved more inclined to keep that oath. But as I've said to Harry, only oaths to ancient and noble houses can be enforced through magic, and that's usually a judgment after the oath has already been broken. Oaths in general are nothing more than verbal contracts. All three Grangers went to ask a question and all stopped abruptly and looked at each other to decide which was going to get the chance to ask their question. Sirius and Harry exchanged smiles at the silent Granger communication going on in front of them. Both parents looked at their daughter expectantly and Hermione sat back with a quiet huff as she acknowledged she'd already had the opportunity to ask 2 questions. Wallace waved a hand at his wife. Miriam smiled. You said this was the fashion, but no longer. Life debts aren't usually acknowledged these days, and if they are, usually at the insistence of the older generation, then it's a token gesture of favor or money. Sirius said. However, the houses follow the tradition between themselves as it's a matter of honor. Now my question, Wallace said, raising his own beer, what does a life debt have to do with Hermione? Your daughter, along with Harry, saved my life. Sirius answered simply. Miriam and Wallace glanced at their daughter, who was turning cherry red under the attention. I assume because she gave evidence to aid your acquittal? Miriam asked, perplexed. Sirius raised an eyebrow at Hermione in a silent question of have you told them, and received a brief shake of her head in response. Harry threw her an apologetic look. They hadn't meant to get her in trouble. On the night I was captured at Hogwarts, Sirius said firmly, the headmaster gave Hermione and Harry permission to help me escape. They used a magical device to help get them to the right place, found transportation for me and got me out of the office where I was locked up. If it hadn't been for them I would have forfeited my soul to a Dementor. And why is this the first we're hearing about it if you had the headmaster's permission? Asked Wallace, staring pointedly at his daughter. The device, Harry jumped in, the magical device we used. Hermione wasn't supposed to tell anyone else about it. Sirius and I only got told because of the headmaster's permission to use it. Hermione shot him a grateful look and nodded at her parents. "And I didn't want to worry you," she admitted honestly. "I mean, this year has been relatively quiet and normal really compared to first and second year and—" Hermione. Miriam interrupted sternly. Hermione grimaced, her eyes downcast. "Sorry, Mum. We're not angry with you." Miriam cast a look at Harry and Sirius, and Harry got the distinct impression that she regretted the conversation was taking place in front of them, "but I am disappointed that you felt you couldn't tell us, not even in general terms." "I feel I should apologize," Sirius began. "Please don't," Wallace said immediately. "I dare say Hermione's reticence is in part our fault, as we may have indicated to her that we weren't happy with the amount of danger this school of hers seems to place her in every year. Did you know somebody let a troll into the school in her first year which almost killed her? And then she was in a magical coma the year after." He huffed out a breath at Hermione's dejected face. "We discussed not sending her back for her third year, which is why I think someone was reluctant to tell us what happened." Harry was alarmed at that. Hermione had almost been withdrawn. And what now that they knew she'd been in danger again? "It's all my fault," he blurted out. "Nonsense," Miriam said briskly. "From what Hermione said, you saved her from the troll and were playing your broomstick sport when Hermione ended up in the coma. You're a young boy, Harry, it's not your fault these events took place. You've been a good friend to Hermione and you are one of the reasons why we decided to let her continue at Hogwarts." Well, she's been a good friend to me too," Harry said, a little taken aback at the heartfelt praise. He felt Sirius's hand on his shoulder and settled again. "I tell you whose fault it is," Wallace added, "that headmaster of yours. What is he thinking, allowing a troll and things that cause comas to get inside a school with children? And, you'll forgive me, Sirius." Sirius nodded enthusiastically. "But what was he playing at, sending 2 kids to rescue you? Why couldn't he have done it?" "An excellent question." Sirius agreed fervently. "The headmaster is a great wizard and a—" Hermione defended Dumbledore passionately, and Harry knew that before his time at the clinic with Sirius, he might have been eagerly waiting for his turn to do the same. "And a senile old man by the sound of it," Wallace interjected, cutting off his daughter's words. "I'm sorry, sweetheart," Miriam said, "but I agree with your father. If I ever meet this headmaster of yours, believe me, I will have more than a few questions for him." "I feel exactly the same way," Sirius said. There was a moment between the adults that had Hermione and Harry doing a mutual eye roll while their guardians' gazes were occupied elsewhere. Miriam cleared her throat and turned to her daughter. "That said, we're very proud of you, Hermione, for helping to save Sirius's life and see justice get done." "Very proud," Wallace repeated gruffly. Hermione's eyes shone brightly and her mother gave a one-armed hug, squeezing her tightly until the threat of tears went away. Harry fidgeted awkwardly with his glass of lemonade, unsure what to do. "So," said Wallace brightly, "you owe Hermione a life debt." "Yes," Sirius said, enthusiastically returning to the original subject, "and I would like to honor it." Miriam and Wallace exchanged another wry look. "Honor it how exactly?" Miriam asked briskly. Her arm remained around her daughter. Her eyes twinkled suddenly. "If you'd like to offer Harry as a potential bridegroom, I'd have no problems with that." "Mum!" Hermione yelped, going a bright red. Harry figured his own cheeks were a similar color from the heat he could feel. He didn't even look at Sirius because he knew Sirius would just tease him if he did. In some ways, he knew it was a compliment, but in others it was mortifying. Hermione was his friend, and it wasn't that he didn't realize she was a girl, it was just, she was his friend, and why would she be interested in him, he concluded with a fair amount of confusion. "I would offer him," Sirius began mischievously. Harry glared at him. "But Harry will have to choose his own wife." Sirius winked at him. "His dad did a fair job with his mum, so I think he'll choose wisely. Of course, his dad also chose the smartest witch of his generation." There was a ripple of chuckles around the table from Miriam and Wallace at the unsubtle implication that Sirius would be quite happy if Harry did choose Hermione, and Harry smiled apologetically, mouthing a sorry at her. She returned his smile with a shy one of her own. "Are marriage contracts usual in the wizarding world?" Miriam asked. Betrothal contracts are not used anymore, and there was a ruling that effectively declared any old outstanding ones to be null and void just after the war with Grindelwald. Matchmaking still happens to a degree where families may agree an introduction and an intended arrangement. However, contracts to protect assets and agree terms especially for ancient and noble houses are usual. Sirius said. Rumors tells me that there's something similar in the Muggle world. Prenuptial agreements. Miriam supplied. They're only usually done by the very rich though. Well, if we can't get Hermione married off, Wallace said, with a smirk in Hermione's direction, what are you proposing exactly? I'd like to offer her the sponsorship of the House of Black. Sirius said. There are 3 reasons. Firstly, because you don't have magic, you're quite restricted in what you can do as parents to protect her in the wizarding world, either physically or legally. In fact, under our legal system, you have very few rights. Sponsorship by an ancient and noble house means that Hermione would get the same protection as any daughter of my house. While Hermione is at school, it means that the House of Black could act in loco parentis. If Hermione ended up in the hospital wing for an extended period of time, I or my steward could visit and provide a conduit for news. The Grangers exchanged a look of surprised pleasure. We can see the benefits of that, Wallace said, especially after Hermione's second year. Miriam nodded. It was torture getting an owl from Professor McGonagall to say that Hermione was in the infirmary but not be able to see how she was. She patted her daughter's hand. That's why we seriously considered removing you, sweetheart. I'm sorry. Hermione said sadly. I can't even imagine. It must have been awful. Well, sponsorship would help going forward. Sirius said before they all got sidetracked again. Secondly, I would assume financial responsibility for Hermione's education. He brushed aside their first murmurs of protest. Don't worry, I'm very rich. Hermione's parents exchanged a silent look. I can't say we wouldn't appreciate the financial boon of not having to pay for the tuition. Miriam said. We can afford it, but there's always something else we could use the money for, holidays, or I've been wanting to remodel the kitchen, and then there's always the attic conversion we've been thinking of doing, or buying a place in France. The third reason, said Wallace loudly. Sirius coughed to hide a chuckle. It will open up opportunities for Hermione after Hogwarts. A lot of Muggleborns find it difficult to secure high-paid employment in the wizarding world. It's difficult for them. Magical schooling separates them from the Muggle world, so they can't go back easily, and yet the innate prejudices of the wizarding world mean that they face an uphill battle if they want a career in the top flight, the Ministry or St. Mungo's, or apprenticing to some of the masters of our world. The Grangers were frowning. Rumours says it's similar to the Muggle world, where the government for a time only took people from Oxford and Thingamabridge. Sirius offered a little uncertainly. Or even getting into Oxford and Cambridge to begin with, Hermione suggested sagely. She brushed her fringe out of her eyes. I knew we'd have to choose electives for 3rd year, so I started researching career options at the end of 2nd year. I read some of the alumni records that are available in the library and realized the problem then. It's one of the reasons why I took everything I could. Why didn't you say something? Harry blurted out, a little upset to realize that it was something that had evidently bothered his friend enough to send her to the library, but he hadn't known. Well, it was the end of the year, and it's not something that either you or Ron have to worry about, really. Hermione replied, blushing again. I take it sponsorship will help Hermione attain the career she wants? Wallace asked. Sirius nodded. It'll open doors and people won't dismiss her out of hand. But isn't it cheating? Hermione asked worriedly. I mean, I would prefer to get something on my own merits. And you will, Sirius said firmly. Nobody will offer you anything just because you have sponsorship. It's a bit like having Hogwarts as your school. It gives you an advantage, but you'll still have to do the hard work to obtain good grades and the extracurricular stuff that will help you. So we've heard about the benefits of scholarship. What is actually involved? Miriam asked. An oath. Sirius replied promptly. He set his beer down and reached into his satchel, pulling out a sheaf of parchments Rumours had prepared. The full details are in there. Primarily we do a ritual where the sponsor puts a drop of blood into a bowl and Hermione puts a drop of hers, and they each swear an oath, one to do the sponsoring and Hermione to accept. Miriam took the parchments before Hermione could make a grab for them. We'll read these over carefully. I should also tell you that it's not appropriate for me to be Hermione's sponsor as I'm a single male. Sirius said. I'll be asking my cousin Andromeda to take the role. She's married to a Muggle-born wizard called Ted and they have a daughter who has just left Hogwarts to start at the Auror Academy. If you agree, I would like you to meet her ahead of the ritual. If there are any issues, we'll work something else out, but And is a great witch and I don't think you'll have any problems with her. He paused. There is a small problem with timing as we have an additional favor to ask of you. For me, really? Harry inserted quickly. Anything, Hermione said immediately and promptly blushed at the arching eyebrows of her mother. Sirius is going to adopt me the day after tomorrow, Harry told her proudly. Hermione bounced out of her chair, around the table and hugged him. She let go of him and beamed at Sirius and at Harry. That's wonderful. Oh, I'm so pleased for you, Harry. Yes, congratulations again. Miriam said, watching Hermione carefully. Sirius picked up his beer and ruffled Harry's hair. Thank you. We were hoping to do all the rituals on the same day and combine it with a blessing ritual of the protection Harry's mother gave him before she died. That's a very good idea, Hermione agreed, darting another anxious look towards her parents. Harry assumed she hadn't exactly told them about Voldemort either. He couldn't blame her. How will it work? Hermione asked enthusiastically, seating herself next to Harry and almost leaning over him to look at Sirius. Harry inched back a little. Sirius smirked at him. Well, the ritual is runic-based. Each female member of the House of Black will prick their finger and draw a specific protection rune on Harry's forehead, renewing the blessing of his mother. So if I take the sponsorship ritual, I'll be a daughter of the house and could take part. Hermione surmised quickly. Yes, Sirius held up his hand, but only if your parents agree. After some research, we realized the protection spell will eventually erode if Harry doesn't live periodically with his aunt. As that's not going to happen going forward, we think this ritual will acknowledge the adoption and mean Harry will only have to live with a member of the Black family. That's so clever. Hermione looked admiringly at Sirius. It was Remus's idea. Harry said. His former professor had put a lot of work into researching the spells and understanding their complexity. Sirius coughed. Yes, it was. He waved towards the parchment. Remus thought you would appreciate the details. He returned his gaze to Miriam and Wallace. If you consent to the sponsorship before Wednesday, then it would be great to have Hermione involved, as she, out of all the female members of the house, will be the only one to actually have an actual existing relationship with Harry, and that will strengthen the spell. But if you would like more time to make a decision, we'll understand and can still do the sponsorship ritual another time. We'll look over the information. Miriam promised. I'll send Hedwig tomorrow. Harry promised. She'll have your formal invite to the adoption ceremony. You can let us know by reply. Sirius added. Good. Wallace stated. He motioned towards the grill. Well, if that's the business over and done with, we should throw the meat on. Sirius perked up and followed Wallace over to the smoking apparatus. Miriam rolled her eyes at the men before she gathered up the parchment and got to her feet. I have some finishing touches to put on dessert. Hermione made a move to join her but was waved back into her seat. Stay and keep your friend company, Hermione. Miriam winked at them both and departed. Hermione offered Harry another shy smile. Sorry about all that before. They've been teasing me all summer about whether I'll get a boyfriend next year just because I was complaining about Parvati and Lavender going on about dates in Hogsmeade. Harry frowned. He hadn't thought about Hermione dating anyone. The thought disturbed him and he wasn't sure why. Maybe he was just worried she'd stop being his friend, Harry mused, which was silly because Hermione wouldn't drop him for a boyfriend any more than he would drop her if he got a girlfriend. He truly hadn't thought about dating and girls himself beyond noticing sometimes that some of his classmates were getting pretty and cute like he'd done with Hermione when he'd arrived, or with Kimmy at the clinic. He'd ignored Dean and Seamus when they'd mentioned girls they fancied, and Ron had never brought up the topic. But then Harry had never really taken part in the boyfriend-girlfriend stuff before. In primary school, when his classmates had been playing at it more than anything, nobody had approached him because of Dudley, and Dudley had been kicked in the privates the one and only time he'd tried to play kiss chase with a girl. It was one of Harry's favorite memories. He'd actually been pleased when he'd started Hogwarts that boyfriend and girlfriend stuff didn't seem to be a thing in the wizarding world, possibly because it was slightly old-fashioned compared to the Muggle world. He guessed he was going to have to think about it more in the coming year. It was fairly common knowledge around the school that most people started dating in fourth year. A few of the third years had already begun because Hogsmeade provided a date venue. He hadn't totally escaped the gossip that filled the Gryffindor common room or the whispers in the classrooms. Great, he thought morosely, how was he supposed to go about dating girls? Hermione patted his hand, obviously reading his expression correctly. Don't worry about it, Harry. She smiled at him. I wouldn't be surprised if there was a queue of girls lined up when you are ready to ask someone. Really? Harry looked at her doubtfully. Who would want to date me? She rolled her eyes at him. Only most of the girls in our year, and probably a lot in the others too. You're considered quite the catch, and I can imagine the publicity from the summer is going to just increase your fanshability. Is that even a word? Harry teased before he grimaced again. Anyway, from what you're saying, most of the girls want to go out with the boy who lived, not me. He could see Hermione open her mouth to protest, but she closed it again abruptly. I guess you might be right about that, she admitted softly. But as someone who knows you, I think they'll be happy once they get to know you, and if you don't date them, how are they going to get to know you? Maybe. Harry said, uncertain she was right. I was thinking it might be good to make some new friends next year. You and Ron are great and my best friends, and that's not going to change, he hastened to assure her, but it just occurred to me that I don't have a lot of other friends. You probably have more than me. What about the Quidditch team? Hermione said, and Neville, Dean and Seamus. The Quidditch team are great, and Fred and George, maybe, are friends, but Oliver was, well, Oliver, the girls are older than me. Harry said. As for the guys in my dorm, I guess I'm about as close to Dean and Seamus as you are to Parvati and Lavender. We're mates but not friends. Hermione nodded in acknowledgement. Neville. Harry smiled, I'm hoping to get to know Neville better this summer. He's going to join me for some lessons. Our mothers were best friends at school. His mum was my godmother and my mum was his. Oh, wow. Hermione said. Her eyes narrowed. What lessons are you doing? Harry brightened and gave her the headlines: wizarding etiquette and culture, politics and estate management, runes and magic. But what about the underage? Medical exception. Harry grimaced. Sirius got custody of me the night before they announced his being innocent. We've been away at a healing clinic this past week. He explained the time bubble at the clinic, and his treatment and power issues. He picked up Sirius's bag and took out the journal and the wrapped present. Because of the amount of time we were there, one of the healers suggested I write to you and Ron in a kind of journal as though I was sending you letters. I put all my politics lessons in there too, since I figured you'd want to know about it. He handed her the journal and the gift. I picked the present up at the airport. It's a book on American magic, thought you might like it, but it's okay if you don't. Harry. Hermione said, delighted. Thank you. You didn't need to get me anything. The journal would have been enough. She was already holding on to it tightly. Her front teeth sank into her lower lip. Do you think Sirius will let me join you and Neville for your lessons? Harry nodded. If your parents are okay with it. He glanced toward Wallace and Sirius to make sure they were engaged in a discussion and lowered his voice. I take it you didn't tell them everything about Voldemort and what happened with the stone. Hermione nodded. They kind of freaked out at Christmas about the troll, so, no. She sighed. I doubt I would have told them about the basilisk, but obviously they found out from the school I was petrified and I pretended it was no big deal so they wouldn't worry. She made an unhappy face. I had no idea it was so bad for them. He moved to put his hand over her arm. You couldn't have known, and if it helps any, Sirius freaked out about everything when he found out too. There was a shared moment of solidarity between them. Well, that helps explain why he said what he did about the headmaster. Hermione noted with a hint of disapproval. I thought he'd be more grateful to him. Hermione, your parents were right. Harry interrupted fiercely. Dumbledore could have saved him himself. He's Chief Warlock. He could have placed Sirius in his protective custody and overruled Fudge, but he didn't. Hermione's mouth opened and closed again. Her shock was written all over her face. But surely. She searched Harry's eyes for something, anything to explain it, but why didn't he then? Me. Harry said succinctly. He took a breath to keep his temper under control. Dumbledore was the one who left me with the Dursleys, Hermione. We think he was trying to make sure I went back there and didn't have somewhere else to go. But that's awful. Hermione exclaimed. How could he leave you with those terrible people and, oh, this is just too much. Sirius thinks it has to do with this spell that my mum did and some wards she put up at my aunt's. Harry admitted. He thinks Dumbledore was trying to protect me. She looked furious for a second before her face froze into mute horror. What? Harry asked. Hermione sighed heavily and leaned closer to him, lowering her voice. You don't think he was Chief Warlock when Sirius was imprisoned and he should have made sure Sirius got a trial? Do you? Harry was already shaking his head. Sirius doesn't think it was deliberate. He says Dumbledore should have checked, but that he's pretty sure from the conversation they had in the office when Sirius was captured that Dumbledore honestly thought he was guilty. He shrugged. It doesn't matter. Dumbledore's in Thailand and by the time he gets back I'll be adopted and he won't have a say in it anymore. It's just so unbelievable. He's always seemed so good and kind and great. Hermione said miserably. He's Albus Dumbledore. He's not supposed to make mistakes. Harry said quietly. Sirius says nobody is perfect. I guess not. Hermione said with a huff. She sighed and changed the subject. Ron sent a letter with Errol. He's invited us to the Quidditch World Cup. My mum and dad are thinking about that too, although I'm not really sure I want to go. Have you talked with him yet? Harry shook his head. We've only been back a couple of days and we've been settling into our new house. We're supposed to be seeing them tomorrow evening to give them an invite to the adoption. Ron and his parents, I mean. She bit her lip again. You're not inviting Ginny? Her question took him aback. He hadn't really had much contact with Ginny over the past year, although they'd exchanged small talk in the common room and sat together occasionally at meals. He'd tried to pay her some attention since the previous year had been so horrible for her, but he felt awkward around her. He still half expected her to fall into her butter dish if he was honest. If I invite Ginny then I have to invite Fred and George, and I don't really have an issue with it, but Sirius wanted to keep it small. Would it be so bad? Hermione asked. It's just, Ginny and I chatted a bit at the end of the year and she wants to get to know you better. If we want to make more friends like you were saying before, and I actually think that's a good suggestion, we should try and get to know more people. Ginny might be a good place to start. Harry sighed and confessed the real reason. Yeah, but I think Ginny has a crush on you. Hermione nodded. Of course she does. Then why? Because, Harry, she wants to get past it and become your friend. Hermione said. I know it's awkward, but the boy who lived was her childhood hero and you saved her life, so of course she has a massive crush on you. It's quite a lot for her to get past. I helped save your life and you didn't get a crush on me. Harry pointed out, proud of his logic. Hermione blushed and looked a tad guilty. Harry stared at her speechless as he realized the implication. Look, that was me. Obviously I was mature enough not to get a crush on you. Hermione's cheeks reddened even more as she blatantly lied, and she made a hand wave as though to dismiss the entire thing. Ginny, I think all she really wants is a chance to get past her crush and get to know you. I'm not promising anything, Harry said, deciding they should drop the subject quickly rather than dwell on the fact that Hermione had once had a crush on him, but I'll talk with Sirius about inviting all the Weasleys. Hermione smiled at him brightly. Thank you, Harry. She frowned suddenly. You know I owe you a life debt for the troll and Merlin. I owe Ron too. I don't think so, Harry said. From what Sirius told me, you can't owe someone a life debt if they were responsible for placing you in danger in the first place, and Ron was the reason why you were in the bathroom. He waved his hand. As for me, if you ever did owe me anything, you've saved my life since, and besides, saving Sirius paid it back tenfold, Hermione. Her eyes took on a mischievous glint. I tell you what, just to make sure there are no debts between us, I'll run interference for you if Ginny gets too crushy. That isn't funny, Harry exclaimed hotly, although he wasn't truly mad at her teasing. It's a little funny, Hermione retorted, and besides you should be happy someone likes you. Her face fell. I don't think I'm going to have a queue of boys lining up to ask me to Hogsmeade. Harry felt the same disturbed lurch in his belly as he had earlier, but his need to reassure her trounced it. Unfortunately he had no idea how to reassure her and settled for squeezing her arm absently. She smiled at him in appreciation, though, so maybe it had been the right thing to do. The sound of a throat being cleared at the head of the table had them both looking up sharply. Sirius smirked at Harry. His gaze fell pointedly to where Harry was still holding on to Hermione's arm. Harry blushed bright red and let go. Your dad wanted your help, Sirius told Hermione. She sighed and headed over to the grill. Sirius sat down and grinned at Harry. Don't, Harry warned him briskly, or I'll tell Remus about the time Healer Fey was over when we were swimming and you lost your... We swore we would never speak of that, Sirius reminded him quickly. He stared at his godfather. Fine, no teasing about how cozy you and Hermione were looking, Sirius promised in a grumbling tone. Harry breathed a sigh of relief and sat up straighter as Hermione returned with a plate of piled high with burgers, steaks and chops. I hope you're hungry, Miriam said with a laugh as she and Wallace rejoined them. The topic of conversation turned to questions over how comfortable Sirius seemed in the Muggle world, and Harry sat back, content to listen to tales of how his mum had made sure the Marauders could handle Muggle things. He glanced at Hermione and felt his stomach flip-flop again. He was hungry, Harry thought determinedly, that was probably all it was. Sirius paced nervously in the reception room. There was a lot riding on the outcome of the meetings he was about to hold. If things didn't work out as he and Remus hoped, they would deal with it, Sirius thought briskly. There was always the Obliviate spell. He heard the approaching cheery voice of Penelope and hastily smoothed his formal robes as she and Remus entered. Penelope smiled at him brightly. Very smart, Lord Black. How many times do I have to tell you, it's Sirius? He complained at her good-naturedly. Not during working hours. Penelope reprimanded him as she brushed imaginary lint from his shoulders. You have an image to convey. Remus smirked at him and handed him a black canvas bag. Here's the pensive and the memories. He patted his arm. You'll be fine, Padfoot. It's only fudge. Right, Sirius said, and whose idea was that I should be the one to tell him and not Brian as we originally agreed? Brian's. Penelope and Remus chorused together. Sirius glared at the two of them. Look, I think Brian's right, Fudge will probably take the news of you being Lord Black better if you tell him yourself, Remus said. According to Brian, he's all agog at the request of a one-to-one meeting with you on the subject of Lord Black ahead of the Lord Black meet and greet session later this afternoon with Directors Bones and Croaker here at the Manor. You'll be fine. If I get thrown back into Azkaban, I'm blaming you, Sirius stated dryly. Penelope cleared her throat. You should get going, Lord Black. You don't want to be late, the minister is expecting you. Sirius turned to Remus and opened his mouth. Yes, I'll go back to Griffin House and check on Harry later. I'm sure he and Minerva are getting along fine though. Remus ushered him towards the flue. Sirius harumphed, took a deep breath and tossed some power into the fire. Minister's office. He stepped out into Fudge's private domain and straightened immediately, staring at the two Aurors flanking the minister with suspicion. Fudge immediately got a clue about Sirius's discomfort and gestured back at the Aurors. Oh, they're here just a precaution in case someone else stepped out. Sirius moderated his tone to something vaguely diplomatic. If the Aurors would like to check me for glamours or polyjuice they are certainly welcome to do so, Minister. Fudge waved the Aurors forward. Shacklebolt. Dawlish. Apologies, Mr. Black. Shacklebolt said formally. We won't be more than a moment. He lifted his wand and did an intricate gesture to start the identification spell that Sirius knew well. It was mandatory Auror training, as was Dawlish's position. He'd stayed back to cover Shacklebolt. Dawlish he knew from his Auror days, a miserable GIT who Sirius had half suspected of being a Death Eater. Shacklebolt, Shacklebolt. Kingsley Shacklebolt? Sirius asked. I seem to remember you were at the academy after I completed my hit wizard training. That's right, Mr. Black. Kingsley smiled at him politely. You held most of the records we were trying to beat. He turned to the minister. He is Sirius Black, Minister. May we ask what's in the bag? Dawlish asked roughly before his partner could ask for them to be dismissed. Sirius raised an eyebrow. A present for the minister for his sterling effort to uphold justice. Fudge broke into another pleased smile and almost clapped his hands together in delight. He made a wavy hand gesture at the Urras. Please leave us, gentlemen. The Urras left Dawlish with obvious reluctance. Sirius. May I call you Sirius? You must call me Cornelius. Fudge charged forward as soon as the office door closed behind the Urras and held out his pudgy hand. Welcome to the ministry. Sirius shook hands. Sirius is fine, Minister. He requested permission to raise a privacy bubble and Fudge Cornelius smiled ruefully. Brian does the same thing. Cornelius said amused as he indicated for Sirius to go ahead. This is the safest office in Britain. I'm afraid I attended the Alastair Moody School of Constant Vigilance, Minister. Sirius said. He waved his great-grandfather's wand around and nodded happily when the privacy spell took and the office was secured. You've probably guessed the reason for this meeting already, Cornelius, so I won't keep you in suspense. Sirius began as he placed the canvas bag on the minister's desk. Brian said he suspected you'd worked it out when he mentioned how quickly I was able to respond to the query about custody when he had initially written to Lord Black. Well, Cornelius looked fairly bemused as he took his seat. Obviously you realized then that I was indeed, Lord Black. Sirius announced briskly, ignoring blithely the different shades of red that Cornelius was turning. He mentally took away the concealment spell on his ring and waggled it at the minister. I can't tell you how much I appreciate your discretion in keeping my secret to date and supporting my guardianship of Harry. I am in your debt. He pulled out the brand new pensive from the bag and set it down in front of Cornelius. I hope you accept this as a small token of my thanks and appreciation. Cornelius's eyes dropped to the magical artifact and gasped. It's top of the line, newest model. Sirius stated as he took a seat. As you know, many countries have provided pensives for their ministers for years, and it's criminal that the Wizengamot hasn't authorized budget for you to have one yet. Criminal, yes. Cornelius touched it reverently. I can't tell you how envious the American ambassador is going to be the next time he comes round. This is much better than the one in his office. He sat back suddenly and gazed at Sirius. This was the pivotal moment, Sirius mused. Cornelius knew that Sirius probably knew that Cornelius hadn't guessed at all, but Cornelius had two choices, to throw his toys out of the pram or to graciously allow them both to pretend that he had guessed, save face and continue to develop a relationship with Lord Black. Sirius also knew that Cornelius had to be considering the fact that not only was Sirius Lord Black but he was also the Potter Regent. His eyes had already skated over the crests on his robes twice. Cornelius cleared his throat. I have to confess that while I did suspect, as Brian surmised, I didn't actually know for certain that you were Lord Black. Lord Black. I thought we agreed it was Sirius. Sirius said smoothly. He was surprised at Cornelius's admission, but it was a good ploy, a half-truth but not an all-out lie, something that allowed Cornelius to save face, but acknowledged the truth at the same time. Cornelius smiled widely at him. Sirius it is. My new assistant calls me Lord Black and I keep looking for my grandfather. Sirius joked, trying to remember all the lessons at political glad-handing that his father and mother had literally beaten into him. I remember when my parents found a tutor for me before Hogwarts and Professor Lycan called me Mr. Fudge for the first time. I thought he was referring to my father and wouldn't answer him. Cornelius replied with good humor. I received a fair few raps on the knuckles for that. Harry finds being Lord Potter quite strange, but then nobody has ever told him about his house responsibilities until this summer. Oh. Cornelius frowned. I mean, I'm not surprised at the Muggles, because what would they know about it but surely Albus? Sirius shook his head. I'm afraid not. He didn't have to pretend the heavy grimace that he made. Harry has been left entirely too uninformed about his place in our world, not just the boy who lived nonsense, but the House of Potter, his family, his heritage. He sighed. I've been told that his teachers were made to promise not to tell him about his mother and father. That is terrible. Cornelius commiserated. I've had concerns about how Albus has been handling things at Hogwarts for a number of years now, but his hold on the school is absolute. Speaking of concerns, Sirius said, turning the conversation to what he was really there for, I did have an ulterior motive for getting you the pensive. He reached back into the canvas bag and extracted 3 vials filled with silvery fluid. With your permission, I'd like to show you some copies of Harry's memories from his time at Hogwarts. I'm not certain how much you know already, how much information Albus has shared, but I believe it's important for you to see them. However, I must have an oath that you will keep this information confidential. Cornelius nodded slowly. I'm intrigued, so I'll agree. He picked up his wand. I, Cornelius Ambrose Fudge, swear to the House of Black to keep the contents of this meeting confidential. There was a flash of light from the tip of his wand and Sirius was satisfied. He motioned for Sirius to fill the pensive and they dived into the basin. The memory began with Harry and his friends approaching the Cerberus and went from there. What is this exactly? Cornelius asked a tad impatiently. Some kind of student obstacle course for their first year Dada exam. I can understand your concern, the dog is a bit much. I'm afraid it's nothing as benign as an obstacle course, Sirius replied. This is a set of traps created by the Hogwarts professors to protect Flamel's Philosopher's Stone, or at least that's what they are supposed to be protecting. Somebody has already gotten past them and Harry and his friends are trying to stop the potential thief. He pointed Cornelius back at the action. They watched silently for the most part, although Cornelius muttered a good show as Harry caught the key. As Harry faced Quirrell and Voldemort, Cornelius paled considerably. Sirius had thrown up, so the minister was actually doing better than he had done at that stage. He was shaking by the time Sirius led him out of the memory just after Harry's discussion with Dumbledore in the infirmary. Sirius had been livid when he'd seen it for the first time. Remus had stuck him to a chair until he'd cooled down enough to agree that trying to find Dumbledore in Thailand to hex him was a bad idea. Fire Uhisky, prompted Sirius gently. Cornelius pointed at a cabinet and Sirius retrieved the alcohol and poured him a generous amount. He resumed his seat and waited for Cornelius to speak. I assume there's no hoping that the memory has been tampered with or that this isn't an elaborate fantasy of young Harry's. Cornelius said eventually, his hands wrapped tightly around his whiskey glass. It's my intention to show the memory to Amelia Bones and Wilbert Croker later. I'm sure they can both vouch for the authenticity. Sirius said firmly. I'm certain it can be independently verified for that matter if necessary. No, just. Cornelius took a gulp of his drink and slumped back in his chair. I can't believe that you know who is still out there. He was supposed to be dead. How could Albus not tell anyone? In part to protect the wizarding world, I suspect. Sirius replied. From what I've heard, the days following the downfall of Voldemort back in 81 were chaotic, with some Death Eaters walking free because of lack of evidence. Had they known for certain their leader was still around, I assume they would have continued their reign of terror and helped him find a body. I can appreciate why Albus may have kept it quiet back then. Cornelius sighed as he absorbed the truth of Sirius's words. And it's also probable that Albus didn't know for certain. Sirius said. My steward and I are convinced that Albus constructed the entire thing with the stone as a trap to prove Voldemort was alive, using both the stone and Harry as bait. Well, he should have told me then. Cornelius stated angrily. Sirius gazed back at him calmly. Perhaps he would have, Cornelius, but your closest advisor since Harry returned to the wizarding world has been Lucius Malfoy. What's Lucius got to do with it? Cornelius asked, evidently honestly bewildered. Lucius is one of those Death Eaters who walked free. Sirius replied. He held up a hand when Cornelius went to argue. I've investigated the matter thoroughly, Cornelius. He's married to my cousin and tomorrow will be subjected to our family magic. As you can imagine, I wanted to be very sure of my facts. Cornelius's eyes widened dramatically. Yes, I can imagine. But I still can't believe Lucius would. I mean, I know about the Imperius, of course, but he assured me that he simply agreed with you-know-whose wider political agenda and the whole thing got blown out of all proportion. I will agree that he was under the Imperius the day he got caught in the ministry. Moody was the one who diagnosed him, so I have some confidence in that. Sirius stated. I'll even accept that there was no additional physical evidence of wrongdoing apart from the dark mark he had. His wand was clean at the time. However, I can unequivocally say as someone who went undercover with Death Eaters that you can't get the dark mark if you're under the Imperius. You have to be a willing recipient. There's also an initiation, a murder of an innocent. Now perhaps Lucius only performed such an act at his initiation, and beyond that his political influence and position at the ministry were more of a benefit to Voldemort than having Lucius out raising terror. But the main point holds, Lucius was a Death Eater. Cornelius downed his glass of fire whiskey and poured himself another. Now, I doubt he knows for certain that Voldemort is back, but I think he must have his suspicions. His political advice and agenda are in line with Voldemort's. He's sponsored and voted for laws and motions that would benefit Voldemort if he returned. The DMLE and DOM budgets have been massively reduced. Certain members of our population, such as werewolves and other magical races, have been disenfranchised and would probably not give us aid now. Would Lucius rejoin him if Voldemort gained a body? I don't know. Sirius said. His answer will certainly determine his fate tomorrow. I should have him arrested. Cornelius said passionately. All this time and he's been using me. Lucius is a consummate politician, Cornelius. Whether he's trying to get power to assist Voldemort in usurping the government or simply trying to get power for himself as part of the existing government, of course he was going to befriend the most powerful man in the ministry and work to become his chief confidant and advisor, to get his own agenda pushed before all others and convince you of its merits. Sirius pointed out briskly. But, legally, he's done nothing wrong, nothing is provable about his Death Eater activities. I suggest you leave him to me to deal with and simply disassociate yourself. Nobody will be surprised that you distance yourself, since it's well known among Zengamot members that the House of Black holds primacy over the House of Malfoy. Cornelius breathed in deeply and nodded. You're right, of course. I will leave it in your capable hands, and distance myself from the man. I would also suggest, if I may, that you should also consider distancing yourself from those who rely and seek out his advice or agree fervently with his agenda. Sirius advised. Your senior undersecretary seems to be a capable woman, but perhaps it's time to reward that with an ambassadorship to a South American country. For a moment Sirius thought Cornelius was going to defend her, but he finally sighed regretfully. She is wonderfully capable, but you're quite right. He smiled benignly. Perhaps it is time for her to move on. Sirius picked up the second vial. Talking of moving on, are you ready for the next memory? He wasn't surprised when Cornelius downed his drink again before allowing Sirius to take him back into the pensive. Harry's encounter with the shade of Tom Riddle and the basilisk was horrifying. Sirius had wanted to close his eyes the entire time he'd watched it, but informative. Luckily Cornelius wasn't as pale and shaky when he came out, but rather determined looking. Perhaps, Sirius considered wryly, learning Voldemort was still out there and Lucius had conned him was the worst news. Everything else was manageable. Tell me that the diary was the only thing that could bring him back like that. Cornelius said harshly. I can't. Sirius said. He and Remus had agreed that the word Horcrux would never be shared, although Croaker would probably know even if he wasn't explicitly told. My brother Regulus was a Death Eater, but he came to realize Voldemort didn't have any respect for purebloods and so turned on him and sent me a letter telling me all about these objects. Unfortunately I only received his letter once I became Lord Black. There are other objects like the diary. We'll need to work together to track the others down and destroy them. Of course. Cornelius agreed. Our theory is that these objects may have helped Voldemort escape death in 81, if we get rid of these. Sirius sighed. We can trap him again and get rid of him for good. However, there is an immediate concern. He led Cornelius back into the third memory, Trelawney's prediction of Pettigrew helping Voldemort to rise again. Well, this certainly adds some urgency to the matter. Cornelius said anxiously as soon as they left the pensive. He shakily poured himself another glass of fire whiskey. We're just not prepared. I thought he was dead. How was I to know? And Cornelius. Sirius barked at the minister. Pull yourself together. Of course, you couldn't know. The public isn't going to blame you for acting like a peacetime minister for the last few years when they believed the same thing. But they will judge you on what you do now. Cornelius made an effort and calmed down. Believe me when I say that this is my top priority, Sirius said firmly. Voldemort has an unhealthy fascination with Harry. I will do everything in my power to make sure Harry is safe from that monster. As of now you have the considerable influence and wealth of the House of Black and the House of Potter backing the ministry, Cornelius, in ensuring we rid ourselves of Voldemort for good. He wasn't surprised when Cornelius brightened considerably. Obviously we need to bring Amelia Bones and Wilbert Croaker into this, Sirius said. But I'd like us to present a joint plan to them. I've outlined one with my steward. With your permission I'll take you through it now. Cornelius nodded absently. What about Albus? Do you see a role for him? Sirius grimaced and sank back in his chair. My first inclination was to try and do it without him. He led the light the last time and we almost lost. It was only because Voldemort was trounced by the Potters somehow that we gained a victory. He had no intention of telling Cornelius exactly how much power Harry had or about the spell Lily had used. He sighed. He's also kept information secret, and while I agree with some of his reasons, I disagree with some of his decisions. By all reports, you two were close when you first took office. He could have shared his suspicions about Voldemort to you, then warned you about Lucius. There are also decisions about Harry that I have issues with. But, prompted Cornelius, I'm assuming there is a but. But as my steward has pointed out to me, Albus is a powerful and knowledgeable wizard. If we can utilize him we should, Sirius said. As my steward has always been the more sensible and level-headed of the two of us, I value his opinion. For what it's worth, I agree with your steward, Cornelius said. Like you, I'm not happy Albus hasn't shared information of vital importance, but he is the only wizard that could face Voldemort and expect to survive the fight, perhaps with the exception of young Harry, who obviously has survived a number of encounters. He paused. With that last thought and everything else you've said in mind, I agree Albus shouldn't be the banner under which we fight this time. Sirius caught the gleam in Cornelius's eye. I appreciate that people will fight under the banner of the boy who lived. However, I don't want Harry exploited in the press. It will only serve to focus Voldemort's attention on him even more, and that's unacceptable to me. He paused. Behind the scenes, I have no issues with Harry's status as the boy who lived being used to persuade the reluctant into the political alliances we'll need. Perhaps then we focus on ensuring what press there is continues to be positive, Cornelius suggested. The press are likely to print stories about Harry regardless, especially since, well, I really shouldn't say anything, but I'm sure you won't tell the Triwizard Tournament is being revived and will be held at Hogwarts this year. Harry won't be old enough to participate, but the press will be allowed access to Hogwarts for the first time since he began his time there, and, well, you can see the attraction for the journalists. Sirius thought the whole tournament thing sounded like a very bad idea, but he doubted it was something he could change. Cornelius was also right. The press would go after Harry regardless of whether Sirius tried to keep them away or not. It was better to try and control their public image than allow a free-for-all. Some press then, but everything is approved by me through Brian, as we did this last week. Agreed. Cornelius smiled at him. It's marvelous how well we work together. Shall we cover the rest of the plan? Sirius bit down on his snooky retort and pulled out a parchment from the bag. He didn't need to like Cornelius to work with him, Sirius reminded himself, and it was time to get to work. Oh. It was weird seeing one of his professors during the summer, Harry mused ruefully as he showed Professor McGonagall down to the basement. It was shielded so the rest of the Muggle house could function as normal. Harry didn't really understand it, but knew electricity didn't work well around magic, and that the basement and the kitchen were the only rooms in the house that were magic-proofed. The basement so they had a practice room, and the kitchen because it was Dobby's domain. Apparently, Dobby switched the electricity off room by room when he cleaned the house. Harry had questioned why Remus and Sirius had bought a Muggle house, and it had come down to two things: 1, making Harry comfortable, and they knew he was more familiar with a Muggle home, and 2, because living in a Muggle area helped keep Harry safe, as wizards often found navigating the Muggle world difficult. The fact that they had Muggle technology was great. They'd had a movie night with Star Wars, and Harry had shocked Remus and Sirius by inviting Dobby too. The house elf had been glued to the entire film, his thin arms wrapped around a bowl of popcorn. Additionally, after a few days of living with Sirius and Remus marauders, he was also very appreciative that they had to keep the magic to a minimum. They both had quite an evil sense of humor, and Harry was certain that at some point he'd be a target. Professor McGonagall cleared her throat, recapturing his attention. She had set her carpet bag on the side table and was apparently waiting on him. He flushed. "Sorry, Professor." To his surprise, she smiled at him. "Outside of school, you may call me Aunt Minerva like your father did, if I may call you Harry. What do you think?" Harry was stunned and settled for nodding his head. He gestured at her and forced the words out of his mouth. "My dad called you Aunt Minerva." "Yes," Professor McGonagall said briskly as she began to unload the bag with small objects that Harry recognized from their transfiguration lessons, although when James got older and cheekier he called me Aunt Minnie. "I was good friends with your grandmother Potter, we were at school together. Remus said you might tell me some stories." Harry asked hopefully. She paused and turned to him with an apologetic look. "I owe you an apology, Harry. I should have approached you before now and offered to tell you about your family. I have no excuse." "That's okay," Harry said awkwardly. "Remus explained there's a line you have to stick to as a professor where relationships with students are concerned." She nodded sharply. "I also owe you a second apology for allowing the headmaster to leave you with the Dursleys against my better judgment." Harry was speechless again. He'd never expected her to apologize for that. "Professor, I mean, Aunt Minerva, it's fine, really. Sirius explained why the headmaster left me there and I understand. I mean, I was mad about it, but..." He shrugged. He just wanted to forget he had ever lived with the Dursleys. Her gaze rested on him for a long moment. "Well, Sirius and Remus seem to be taking very good care of you." Harry smiled at her. "They're brilliant." Her lips twitched visibly. "Well, shall we do some transfiguration first? Then we can go over the scholarship details. And we can end with afternoon tea and some stories about your mother and father." "Okay." Harry agreed happily. "Now, Sirius has explained to me that you had a binding and that you've been working with constrained powers for the last 3 years. He said that you've worked hard at the healing clinic after the binding was lifted to bring your magic back under control, but you still require practice." She handed him a matchstick. "When you're ready, Harry." He released his wand from its holster and set the matchstick on the table. A wave of a wand later and it was a perfect needle. "Excellent," Professor McGonagall stated brightly. "If we were in school I would be awarding you points. Let's continue." They worked for over an hour, moving from the first year syllabus to the second and then to the third. The one-to-one tuition helped Harry relax around her more as she helped correct his wand movements to make the transfiguration easier or explained something about the theory that he hadn't understood. Slowly, he started to get used to calling her Aunt Minerva, but it was still a conscious exercise and he figured it would be some time before he called her anything but Professor McGonagall in his head. She stopped him after he had successfully completed the exam again. "We should leave it there for today," Professor McGonagall said sternly. "How do you feel?" "A little tired," Harry admitted. "Most wizards your age would be exhausted, Harry," she assured him, beginning to pack everything away. "Clearly your power levels are as impressive as Sirius told me. I rather thought he was playing a prank on me." She shook her head. "You were quite a powerful baby, come to think of it." She smiled at him. "You should consider becoming an animagus. I seem to recall you have a natural gift for it." "I do?" Harry asked, surprised. "Yes," Professor McGonagall said dryly, "you turned yourself into a miniature version of Sirius's form when you were 3 or 4 months old. Your father flued me almost immediately. I'm not sure if he was more disturbed by the fact that you'd changed into a puppy rather than a young stag, or changed at all. I think it was the reason why he placed a binding on you." Harry's mouth fell open and he snapped it closed again. "You knew? You knew that Sirius was an animagus? And my dad? And Mr. Pettigrew?" "Yes." Professor McGonagall nodded. "The summer after your father's 3rd year I was visiting Doria, your grandmother, when your father managed to transfigure his hand into a hoof. He couldn't undo it. I came across him luckily and reversed it. I also worked out quite quickly that he and his friends had taken an unbreakable vow not to tell anyone what they were doing, which was very foolish. She must have caught Harry's confusion because she paused in her packing up. Has anyone explained vows to you? Are they the same as oaths? Harry asked. Very different. Oaths are only enforceable if sworn to family magic, but vows are a promise to magic itself. If someone asks you to take an unbreakable vow and you agree, if you fail to keep the vow, you will lose your magic and quite possibly die from the shock. Professor McGonagall said. Harry frowned. Why would anyone take one? To prove themselves worthy, or because they owe a debt of some kind, or because they are not in a position where they can refuse? Professor McGonagall answered. In the case of your father and his friends, I suspect it had more to do with helping another friend keep a secret. I suspected that they'd realized Remus was a werewolf and that an animagus could spend time with him on a full moon without threat of being turned into a werewolf themselves. And you didn't stop them? Harry asked, curious. He handed her a teacup and she changed it back into a rock. I might have inadvertently forced them into breaking the vow if I'd confronted them directly, so, no. Professor McGonagall confirmed. I did, however, tell your father that he could come to me for any advice or help on any transfiguration problem without fear of reprisal, which he did over the next year or so. And when they all successfully completed the animagus transformation and joined Remus on the full moons, I would keep watch in my cat form to ensure if they ran into difficulties I was nearby to assist. She stopped and looked over at him, gaping at her. You're no doubt shocked I didn't take points and award them detention. Well, you did take all those points from us when we were first years and you caught us out after curfew. Harry pointed out. I'd already taken points from Slytherin's Mr. Malfoy for the same reason. She pointed out. It would have been favoritism not to take points from each of you just because you were in my house. I guess, sighed Harry, although he knew Snape in her position would have simply let his house members go with a detention. And while I realized after speaking with Hagrid that your rule-breaking was done in the same spirit of friendship that motivated your father's full moon affairs, at the time I thought you were playing a prank on Mr. Malfoy. Professor McGonagall admitted with chagrin. Which is also why I ignored your warning about the stone, I'm afraid. To some extent I was as guilty as others in seeing your father in you rather than you for yourself back then. You mean like Snape, I mean, Professor Snape? Harry asked as she closed up the bag and motioned for them to go back up the stairs. And others? Professor McGonagall said firmly. Their conversation paused while they focused on the steps and Harry went over her admission in his head with a frown. As soon as they were seated at the table in the sunroom and provided with refreshments by Dobby, he blurted out his question. How come you didn't realize the Weasley's pet rat was Peter if you knew he was Animagus? Her eyebrows shot upwards. The thought never occurred to me. She admitted ruefully. Not even when the rat lived for years and years. Harry questioned, inching forward in his seat to lean on the table. I assumed the Weasleys were doing what most parents do when a short-lived animal is a pet. Professor McGonagall said. Harry looked at her bemused. Buy a similar-looking animal and pass it off as the same creature. She explained with a small smile. I got a pet fish called Bubbles when I was 5. I loved watching Bubbles swim around in her fishbowl. My mother told me later in life that there were actually 20 different Bubbles until I was the one who found her dead one morning rather than my parents. Oh. Harry suddenly remembered the goldfish Dudley had won one year at the town fair. It had died rather quickly and his Aunt Petunia had replaced it with an identical-looking goldfish. Obviously Dudley had gotten bored soon after, and when that one had died, it hadn't been replaced. I'm not sure I would have recognized Mr. Pettigrew even close up, Professor McGonagall continued. I watched from a considerable distance during the full moons as canines and felines don't mix too well in my experience. Harry stifled a chuckle at the thought of Sirius and Remus chasing their former teacher in her cat form. And truthfully I thought Mr. Pettigrew was dead. The idea that a rat could be him didn't enter my mind. Professor McGonagall said. Just as it didn't enter my mind that Sirius could use his animagus form to escape from Azkaban as he told me this morning. I believed that the presence of the Dementus would have made transforming impossible. Is that why you didn't tell the headmaster that Sirius could be getting into Hogwarts as Padfoot? Harry asked, curious. Her eyes widened. I assumed the headmaster knew. He did find your father and Sirius outside the Willow one full moon in their 6th year in an altercation with Severus. Harry shook his head. Sirius told me they were all in their human forms when the headmaster showed up. Professor McGonagall looked disconcerted. Well, I'm still certain he knows. She took a sip of her pumpkin juice. Shall we discuss the scholarship? Harry nodded and she reached into her bag and pulled out a folder filled with parchment. Now firstly, how much do you know about how Hogwarts assigns places to Muggleborns? Professor McGonagall asked. Not much. Harry said truthfully. Hermione probably knew, it was probably in Hogwarts, a history. Actually, I'm not sure how Hogwarts assigns places generally. Well, it's a long story, Professor McGonagall enthused. Originally, the founders made Hogwarts open to all. It was the first school of its kind. Unfortunately, as you know, there was a falling out over whether Muggleborns would be welcome or not. Eventually, it was accepted that all magical children would be welcome, and the founders simply asked for donations from the families as much as they could afford, if anything. She picked up a chocolate digestive, dunked it in her tea, and ate it quickly before it disintegrated. Then our population grew and Hogwarts began to struggle financially despite the donations because of the sheer numbers. She cleared her throat. Eventually, in order to keep the ministry from assuming control and to retain independence, the headmaster at the time made standard tuition fees mandatory with scholarships available for a small number of places. The ministry had to settle for setting up an alternative school for those unable to afford Hogwarts. This all took place in the last century. So, there's a state school. Like a Muggle comprehensive? Harry asked, wondering why no one had ever mentioned it before. There are 7 now, Professor McGonagall said with a small smile: Belfast, London, Birmingham, Cardiff, Manchester, Durham, and Edinburgh. She listed quickly. Most have an average year intake of around 60 to 80 pupils, although the Irish and Welsh schools are much, much smaller. They don't board, but students either flew or portkey in on a daily basis. They are quite good, although they have to follow a ministry-approved syllabus. Some of our teaching staff came to us having previously worked at one. Professor Babbling taught at the Edinburgh Academy before she came to Hogwarts, and both Professor Flitwick and Professor Vector taught at King's Magic School in London. She paused and continued. And obviously, homeschooling is still chosen by many wizarding families. So why didn't I end up at one of the state schools? Harry asked. She smiled at him again. We have wandered from the point, haven't we? But luckily your question brings it back into focus once more. Generally, we have no upper limit of how many children we can take. Your class is somewhat small, but it was a terrible year in the war when you were born and we lost entire families. She shook herself briskly. To answer your question, Hogwarts has a list. Usually parents apply for their child to be placed upon it when they are born. Your parents did that for you. Your father's parents did that for him. Most members of the Wizengamot will send their children to Hogwarts, as will most senior members of the ministry. Harry vaguely remembered that Vernon had done the same for Dudley with Smeltings. He nodded slowly in understanding. Now, the founders, Helga Hufflepuff to be exact, enchanted a book that lists all magical births within the United Kingdom. It resides somewhere in Hogwarts, but nobody really knows where, not even the headmaster. Professor McGonagall sipped her tea. What does happen is that a month before every child's 11th birthday, a Hogwarts notification is produced and delivered to the headmaster's desk so he can send a letter of acceptance. These days they automatically get transferred to me. But not everybody goes to Hogwarts. Harry said, confused. Exactly. Professor McGonagall said, looking pleased for some reason. I have a house elf who helps me and she checks to see whether or not the student is on our acceptance list. If they are on the list, the usual letter is sent which she signs in my name. If they are not on the list but have magical parents, the notification is forwarded to the parents so they can arrange their child's education. But it's the latter category that we're most interested in for your mother's scholarship, those without magical parents. Professor McGonagall paused to refill her cup and Harry snagged a chocolate digestive from the plate, thinking about what she'd said to him so far. In hindsight, it had been stupid to think that his Hogwarts class were all the magical children of his age in the country. Harry thought, a little chagrined. All Muggleborn notifications are set aside for my action. Professor McGonagall said. All Muggleborns are provisionally accepted at Hogwarts subject to whether they can pay the tuition. The headmaster and the heads of the houses are usually the only people authorized to perform visitations, although occasionally another member of staff is authorized if no one else is available. We deliver the letter personally, reassure the parents to the existence of magic and determine their decision. If they cannot afford the fees, we offer them the opportunity to attend a ministry school and, if they say yes to that, we send the child's name on to the nearest school so they can make the necessary arrangements by mail. They usually send a letter with a portkey and instructions on what supplies the children will need and where to purchase them. What if they refuse to attend? Harry asked. Well, there is no such thing as homeschooling for Muggleborns as they don't know any tutors. Professor McGonagall sighed, her expression turning to one of sadness. If the parents do not want their child to attend magical school at all, we bind the child's magic and obligate the family to the nature of the visit. They say goodbye to us believing that we came to discuss their child attending our school, but they've decided against it and that's it. We have to protect the statute of secrecy. Harry nodded in understanding. Now there are some Hogwarts scholarships already available, Professor McGonagall said. One is for orphans and another is to assist families with multiple children. Harry wondered idly if the Weasleys had received some help from that scholarship before he flushed, reminding himself it wasn't any of his business how his best mate's family afforded Hogwarts. Although the other scholarship might account for how Tom Riddle had been able to attend Hogwarts since he'd grown up in a Muggle orphanage without any money, Harry mused. What I propose is this: if a Muggle-born family cannot afford the tuition and opts to send their child to the ministry school, we will give them the option of applying for your mother's Hogwarts scholarship. McGonagall glanced at him. Is this acceptable to you? Yes. Harry said quickly. You're giving them the option of not applying. McGonagall nodded. Some parents will prefer not to send their children away to school regardless. That's one of the most popular reasons I get from Muggles for turning down Hogwarts even when the parents can afford tuition, and others may see it as charity and refuse it. She motioned with her cup. Those who accept will be told that a decision will be taken on the 1st of August, which is really the latest we can take it. If they receive notification they will have been awarded the scholarship. If they do not, they should proceed with the placement at the ministry school. Okay, so what about this year? Harry questioned. I have already sent the families that opted for the ministry school because of financial concerns a letter asking for them to confirm whether they wished to be considered, to notify me by simply writing yes on the parchment letter. She looked immensely pleased with herself. There are 14 who have said yes. Now what we must do is decide what the criteria will be for choosing the recipient. The discussion that followed was spirited and Harry was pleased when his new aunt encouraged him to put his own ideas forward. She challenged him on some of the suggestions. He'd argued that they should test for intelligence. His mother had been smart, so it made sense to him that the recipient of her scholarship should be smart. Professor McGonagall had wondered how they would test for such a thing and Harry pointed her at the primary school tests. They'd both agreed any superficial things such as hair color or eye color should not be considered, but Professor McGonagall had argued quite fiercely for which is to be considered ahead of wizards. Harry had no issues with that once it came down to the final candidates if there was a close decision that had to be made, but he didn't want gender to factor until then. Yes, his mum had been a witch, but the scholarship was for all Muggle-born children. He'd been gobsmacked when the professor had backed down and agreed. They'd finally come up with a points system. Families who had greater financial need would get more points, primary school tests with better results gained more points, then there would be the assessment of the professor at the interview with the family for general attitude, politeness and what Professor McGonagall called a good disposition and what Harry deemed not Dudley or Draco-like. Gender would be used to make the final call if a boy and a girl ended up within 1 or 2 points of each other. Harry dithered over whether to suggest the last thing, but in the end he gathered his Gryffindor courage and blurted it out. What about their home situation? Professor McGonagall paused in raising the cup to her lips and looked at him sharply. What do you mean, Harry? I mean. He took another deep breath. What if their family is like the Dursleys? I don't mean that they hate magic, because I think those types will already have said no to the entire thing probably, but what if you can tell at the interview that they are not, that they maybe don't love, but I guess. He stumbled over his words. I mean, I wasn't there, so they didn't have to love me, and... He stopped, mortified. He stared down at his empty pumpkin juice. Professor McGonagall reached over hesitantly and put her hand over his. It wasn't you, Harry. The Dursleys would have treated anyone who didn't comply with their narrow worldview the way they treated you, and they were absolutely wrong to do so. They are the worst sort of muggles of people. He glanced up at her and wasn't surprised to see her face set in stern lines, but her eyes were warm and fierce. I can also tell you that it does happen between parents and children too. Sometimes parents don't love their children appropriately or like them very much. In the worst instances, there is neglect and abuse. But there is a large grey area where, rather than outright abuse, there is disinterest or, for want of a better term, coldness. These cases are harder to spot, but we come across them from time to time. She paused. I believe you want us to put all these disadvantaged children ahead of those with comfortable family situations. To help remove them from the home, to at least give them respite. And to give them a home. Harry said, awkward under her kind gaze. Hogwarts is really the first home I can remember. She nodded slowly as though absorbing his words. I see no issues with your suggestion. We will award points again, a larger number, to those children we feel would benefit from a separation from their home environment. She pressed her lips together. I have reported cases of evident abuse in the past to the Muggle authorities, but perhaps I should also report these additional cases too. Harry nodded, relieved she'd agreed and understood what he'd meant. I'll go back through the notes of the interviews for this prior year, Harry. Some of the families with children in these situations may not have responded to my letter, so I will pay them a personal visit. She promised. Harry felt a lot better after hearing that. Well, I think we have a very workable set of criteria, Professor McGonagall said. Is there anything else you want to add? He shook his head. We should take a break, she declared briskly. I could do with stretching my legs, and I'm sure you could do with some exercise. She motioned towards the outside where the sun was shining. How about we take a walk outside and I'll tell you about when I gave your mother her Hogwarts letter. Harry grinned at her and quickly accepted her offer. Sounds great. He hesitated and ploughed on, Aunt Minerva. She smiled understandingly at him. And Harry? He looked at her inquisitively. I swear on my magic that you will never return to the Dursleys. Her eyes flashed with a fierce protectiveness that shocked him. Do you understand? He could only nod at her as he realized she was waiting for some kind of a reply. Good. She rose from her seat, stretched in an absent-minded way that reminded him of a cat, and gestured for him to join her. He scooted out of his chair. Now, your grandmother Marigold was the one who answered the door, she began, and Harry listened intently, eager to hear about his mother and his grandparents, eager to learn about his family. Almost 2 hours of working with Cornelius had reaffirmed Sirius's belief that he didn't like the man. But, and there was a but, he had come to have an appreciation for Cornelius's shark-like predatory instincts about politics. Cornelius knew every single member of the Wizengamot, he knew their position on the key policies and what they would and would not accept, he knew dirt on most of them, and the ones he didn't were the ones who were best at hiding it or who were far too boring to have dirt. He also had a keen sense of the power of the press and how to spin a story. More to the point, Cornelius wasn't stupid. Not about politics and media spin. Not about the threat of Voldemort to his position, to the ministry. He was scared and more than a bit of a coward. Sirius doubted Cornelius would ever be able to face Voldemort with any kind of dignity, and he was lazy on the details of the execution. Sirius had an unfortunate feeling that was how the awful Umbridge woman had made herself invaluable. But Cornelius wasn't stupid. No, Cornelius's main flaw was that he operated from a strange default that doing nothing, maintaining a status quo, meant that he would remain the Minister of Magic. Conversely, when convinced that he would definitely lose his position if he didn't do something, Cornelius had a remarkable sense of self-preservation. It explained why their gambit at clearing Sirius's name and getting Harry away from the Dursleys had worked so well. Sirius was glad that he'd thought to make Cornelius watch Harry's memories first before ever tackling the subject of Voldemort with him. He had a sneaking suspicion that the minister would have preferred to have stuck his head in the sand like an ostrich, but having witnessed absolute proof that Voldemort lived in some form and would try to regain a body, and having a political patron who would not tolerate inaction, Cornelius had had no choice but realize if something wasn't done, his days as minister were numbered. The minister was therefore doing his best to safeguard his own ass, but Sirius didn't really mind that, as it meant Cornelius actually doing his job. In fact, Sirius had eased off the backup plan he and Remus had mulled over of replace Fudge with someone competent, because it turned out Cornelius was competent in his milieu of politics, and as a bonus feature was easily malleable once it was understood what he wanted, to remain Minister of Magic, and how to gain his interest. Assure him that Sirius would make sure Cornelius would always be Minister of Magic if only he could do this tiny thing for Sirius in assisting him in getting rid of Voldemort and revolutionizing their society. He and Remus had underestimated Cornelius, Sirius realized, as he stepped back into Black Manor and watched as Cornelius came through the flue, his eyes wide as he took in the impressive black crest. It was a valuable lesson to learn, and one that they needed to take note of, Sirius mused. They couldn't afford to underestimate anyone if they were going to have a chance at defeating Voldemort and keeping Harry safe. It was a lesson they should have already learned with Peter, Sirius considered tiredly. They'd underestimated Peter when they'd confronted him at Hogwarts and he'd escaped. Okay, there had been extenuating circumstances, Moony and the full moon, and Dementus, but they'd underestimated him nevertheless. In hindsight, they'd also underestimated him back when he'd betrayed them. They'd never considered Peter talented enough to be the spy, to be devious enough despite his being as much of a marauder as any of them. Merlin, Peter had spied as a marauder for them on their targets in the run-up to some of the major pranks. They'd known Peter was smart enough when he wanted to be, he was just very, very lazy. The comments that Minerva had made at times to Peter during their school days had been very sharp and pointed, and all amounted to the same thing: could do better. But the marauders had fallen into the habit of thinking him less smart than the rest of them just because he'd languished in the middle of the class positions, whereas the rest of them had excelled, because after school Peter had headed for a lowly entry position in the ministry in some obscure department to do with flying carpets. And because of that blindness, Peter had betrayed them comprehensively, had sold Lily and James out to Voldemort, had set up Sirius, had hidden in plain sight for years as the Weasleys' pet rat. There was no doubt Peter was a coward and a traitor, a sniveling piece of excrement Sirius wanted to wipe off the face of the earth, but he was sneaky and smarter than they had thought. It would be wise, Sirius thought, to sit down and seriously consider what Peter was likely to have done already to find his master. Sirius led Cornelius through to the front parlor where they were due to meet with Amelia Bones and Wilbert Croaker. Penelope came and knocked on the door. "Welcome back, Lord Black. Shall I arrange for some refreshments for your meeting?" "That would be great, but if you wouldn't mind coming in for a moment, Penelope." Sirius motioned for her to enter fully. "Cornelius, this is Penelope Clearwater, my executive secretary." "Penelope, the minister." Cornelius shook Penelope's hand and offered her a warm smile. "Lovely to meet you, Miss Clearwater. I don't believe I'm familiar with your name." "Penelope's a Muggle-born," Sirius said simply. "Top of her Hogwarts class, very smart. She eventually wants to work for the ministry, but we convinced her to help me out in the meantime." "Well, once you're ready to make a move, you'll have to come and see me," Cornelius said smoothly. Penelope beamed at the minister. "Thank you, sir." She looked to Sirius, who nodded his dismissal, and she headed out of the room. Creature popped in a moment later with the refreshments and disappeared again. By the time Sirius had finished pouring Cornelius some tea and himself a cup of very strong black coffee, Penelope was back, escorting the remaining visitors from the reception room to the parlor. Wilbert Croaker grinned widely as he shook his hand and waved the invitation, with the location written so they could access the house, at Sirius with the other. "Lord Black. A Fidelius charm. I haven't seen one in operation since the Longbottoms. Is it part of the wards, or did you set it up separately? And did you set it up, or was it part of Bertie?" Amelia said sharply. She inched around her dom counterpart and held her hand out to Sirius, who shook it rather than kissing it. She seemed glad of the propriety he showed since they were meeting in her official capacity. "Lord Black, I assume." Sirius smiled at her. "I see Cornelius wasn't the only one who suspected the truth." Amelia's eyes widened, but she got the message quickly enough to play along with the delusion Cornelius had suspected. Indeed, she huffed and nodded a hello at the minister. "Cornelius." "Amelia." "Bertie." Cornelius greeted him with a handshake. "It's good to see you can climb out of the depths of the dom. You never attend my meetings. Well, a new Lord Black sounded interesting, unlike the latest persecution of some hapless magical creature your senior undersecretary wants to pursue. Bertie said simply. He sat down in one of the comfortable chairs and accepted a cup of tea. His grey robes suited his rounded stature and wild white hair. He wasn't as old as Dumbledore, but Sirius knew the man had been at Hogwarts with his own grandfather. His piercing blue eyes gave away his intelligence, and Sirius reminded himself not to underestimate the head of the unspeakables. Amelia took the seat next to Bertie and accepted a glass of pumpkin juice. I have to admit to some curiosity as to why you've brought us together. I assume you're not just meeting us to introduce yourself in your formal position, Lord Black. It's serious, please, Sirius said as Penelope departed the room and closed the door, and no, I've asked to meet you both to discuss something of importance. He gestured with his wand and revealed a pensieve on the coffee table. It was the same model and make as the one he had given Cornelius. He fingered the memory vials in his pocket. I have some memories to share with you. I've already shared them with the minister. These memories are intelligence vital to our national security. Cornelius said pompously. You are both under confidentiality oaths in regards to your positions, and you must treat this information as top secret. Bertie and Amelia exchanged a look, but Sirius was pleased when they both nodded. He poured the first vial into the pensieve and they all dived in. Sirius couldn't bear to watch events a third time, and he kept his eyes on Amelia and Bertie, watching their reaction to Harry's encounter with Voldemort at the end of his first year. Amelia looked furious when they exited, Bertie quietly contemplative. Bertie held up his hand before any of them could speak, and they all deferred to him as the elder. Let us watch all the memories you have to share and then discuss. Sirius nodded his agreement, and they quickly made their way through the other two memories. Amelia sank back in her chair, white with rage and shock. She set her pumpkin juice aside and asked for something stronger. Sirius had creature bring them all a fire whiskey. Well, let's get the facts on the table. Bertie said authoritatively. You know who is still out there thanks to items such as that diary. He seeks a body to return to power, and there is a prophecy that states he will rise again with the help of his servant. I take it the servant is Pettigrew? Amelia questioned gruffly. We think so. Sirius said. Why hasn't Dumbledore said anything, and what the hell has he been doing in that school? Amelia erupted. Kirill's death was reported as an accident. And Dumbledore claimed the situation with the basilisk was under control. She glared at Cornelius. Why you arrested Rubeus Hagrid back then is beyond my understanding. Cornelius flushed. He was heavily suspected of opening the Chamber of Secrets during the first incident way back, Amelia, and his arrest warrant was ordered and signed off by your headera. I merely went along to witness justice being done. Obviously we now know who did it. We should arrange for Hagrid's record to be cleared, and an apology from the ministry wouldn't go amiss. Sirius jumped in before Amelia could continue arguing, but frankly, I think we have more important things to focus on as an immediate priority. We have a plan. Cornelius said swiftly. He nodded at Sirius, who produced the parchment they had been working on in Cornelius's office. There are 3 prongs of attack. Sirius rolled the parchment out on the table and directed the others' attention to it. Firstly, there's Operation Tag the Death Eater. We need to watch all those known Death Eaters that walked. Voldemort will want his followers back. He and Peter are bound to make contact with them eventually. That's a job for the Eras. Amelia said immediately. Our thoughts exactly, Amelia. Cornelius said. We thought a special investigation unit. We will need to make sure the Eras serving in it are not unmarked Death Eaters. Sirius said firmly. Obviously, Amelia snapped, and I will expect vows. My department might be able to help with this too. Bertie said. I have an unspeakable in the intelligence department who was a spy during the last war. We're aware of which of the Eras and Hit Wizards are suspect, along with 2 members of my own department and another dozen throughout the ministry. You've left them in place. Why have you never told me? Amelia asked, furious. Because there was no proof. Bertie said. All I have is the word of my own spy and unsubstantiated hearsay of these individuals' political leanings. But I would suspect all these well-placed Death Eaters is the reason why Albus has never told us his suspicions and shared with us what has happened with Harry Potter in the last few years. He gestured towards the pensive. Well, let's work up a list of targets. Amelia said. I'd like your spy back on the job too if possible. I'll speak with him. Bertie promised. He sighed and tapped the parchment. Your second prong of attack, Operation Treasure Hunt. You think there are more of these objects similar to the diary? We know of 6 in total. Harry destroyed the diary, but there are 5 others. Sirius said. 7 being the magical number. Bertie shook his head. Merlin, Riddle was truly insane. I assume these objects are what I think they are. That a murder must be committed to create one. Sirius nodded curtly. The Unspeakables have studied these objects in the past. They discovered one in Egypt and another in Africa. Once the Unspeakables at the time had learned all they could, the objects were destroyed. There are only 2 methods of disposal: a large furnace with high temperature fire reminiscent of fiend will be sufficient, or dissolution in a highly erosive acid such as basilisk venom. The hunt and disposal should be undertaken by my department. Bertie said solemnly. I wouldn't be surprised if Voldemort had protections around those that haven't been retrieved. Sirius commented. My department can handle it. We have several good curse breakers and spell specialists. Bertie said. As neither of you are actually saying what these objects are, can I assume that they are indeed unspeakable? Amelia said with an amused smirk. Sirius felt his lips twitch and smiled a thank you at her for lightening the moment. They are that. They are evil, most foul. Bertie concurred. We will need independent witnesses to testify that the objects are destroyed by us. I will not have claims that we kept one for study. There is no need, and I will not risk the safety of the wizarding population. I suggest Sirius in his capacity of Lord Black acts as one witness, Cornelius said, nodding his agreement, and perhaps we can do the rest of the honors. I don't disagree, but we're getting ahead of ourselves, Sirius pointed out. We do need to find these objects first. Bertie nodded. I'll put a team together. Again, I will make a vow of loyalty and confidentiality to be mandatory. Well, the last prong belongs to Sirius and I, Cornelius said firmly, and that is Operation Power Play. Sirius refrained from rolling his eyes at the name Cornelius had come up with. Cornelius and I will work on pushing through some new laws to make it harder for Voldemort to gain control. So effectively shutting down his finances and getting us better relationships with those he would ally with. Amelia deduced. Bertie raised his eyebrows. That won't be easy with the current Wizengamot. Sirius smirked. The current Wizengamot is about to find itself with a new Lord Black who is also the Potter Regent. Lucius will be muzzled, one way or another. Cornelius said briskly. The old Pureblood Alliance will find itself adrift from current opinion. I think many of those families will not want to ally with Voldemort when they realize the truth about his origins. Some of them may find themselves eager to remain neutral, at least earned. And we can see that clearly you and Sirius will have the political machinations under control. Amelia cut in. Well, I think we've covered everything, so. Not everything. Bertie said firmly. He turned to Sirius. There is another prong that we have not discussed, your ward, Harry Potter. Sirius found himself pinned by Bertie's perceptive gaze. My godson is not up for discussion. I can understand why you wouldn't want him to be, but I'm afraid he must be. Bertie countered. There is no doubt after seeing these memories that Voldemort has an unhealthy interest in him, that there is a connection. If I was running Amelia's tag team, I'd be watching young Harry because Voldemort will make a move on the boy. There are 2 rituals he could use to create a body that involve the use of an enemy, and I would think Harry would be his target. Even if he doesn't use him in a ritual, I cannot see Voldemort allowing the existence of a boy who almost killed him, who has so defied him, to continue. I think you know this too. Sirius resisted the urge to order everyone out of the house, to run to Griffin House, snatch up Harry and run far away. Instead he forced himself to reply to Bertie. I'm not denying that I know Harry will be a target, but I don't want Harry involved. He's not even officially 14 yet. He's had to face Voldemort too many times as it is. We're the adults here, this should be our job. Here. Amelia said softly. Sirius is right, Bertie. Harry may be the boy who lived, but the key word is boy. This isn't his fight. Bertie sighed. There is a prophecy which sits on a shelf in the dome labeled with both the Dark Lord's name and Harry Potter's. The second confirmation of the prophecy had Sirius flinching and turning away, pacing restlessly to the fireplace and back again. We know. Sirius admitted. My steward and I compared notes on why James and Lily went into hiding, and we realized it was probably a prophecy. Madame Longbottom confirmed it when we renewed the Potter-Longbottom alliance yesterday. Albus never told you? Bertie asked, surprised. The prophecy was told to him by Sybil Trelawney the year Harry was born. Neville Longbottom was the other candidate, but ultimately it was Harry who fitted the bill. You know the exact prophecy? Cornelius asked, speaking up for the first time since Bertie had raised the topic of Harry. No, Bertie said, glancing back at Sirius, but we can guess the contents since it was hearing the beginning of this prophecy that compelled Riddle into attacking the Potters. I believe he hoped to eliminate a prophesied threat. Harry. Cornelius surmised. He looked over at Sirius. We should know the exact contents of the prophecy. I had intended to track it down, Sirius admitted, but let me make one thing clear right now, even if this prophecy says Harry is a threat to Voldemort, it will still make no difference. I will protect Harry as much as possible, and I will proceed with or without your help with the plan. Cornelius's eyes opened wide in surprise. Oh no, I wasn't suggesting we abandon our plan. No, I always believed prophecies are a waste of paper. I never did get the point of divination. He made a dismissive gesture with one hand. Whole load of hooey if you ask me, but we should know what the prophecy says to understand what you know. Who knows? I believe Sirius here needs to know, Bertie corrected, and his ward if that's his decision, but the rest of us don't need to know. He spread his hands out wide in a conciliatory gesture. We don't actually know how much of the prophecy Voldemort knows. My spy believed Voldemort's intelligence about the prophecy was sketchy at best and learned from a Death Eater eavesdropping on Dumbledore and Trelawney's meeting. I agree with Bertie. Amelia said firmly. As much as I abhor that Dumbledore hasn't shared vital information, the reality is that we should keep certain things on a need-to-know basis even among the four of us who I guess form a war council of sorts. The exact nature of unspeakable objects at the heart of the treasure hunt prong is obviously one need-to-know piece of information, the prophecy is another. There may be political maneuverings that are best left between yourself and Lord Black, Cornelius. Cornelius didn't look pleased, but he nodded. Very well. He turned to Sirius. May I offer you additional protection for Harry? Thank you, but no. Sirius replied politely. I believe the best way to protect Harry outside of Hogwarts is to ensure as few people as possible know and have access to his location and plans ahead of time. And inside Hogwarts? Amelia asked, pointing at the pensive. I don't know about you, but I will definitely be following up with Dumbledore on a number of issues after seeing those memories, and I would think you'll do the same. And you'd be right. Harry loves Hogwarts and I won't keep him from attending, Sirius confirmed, but by the same token, I'm going to need some reassurances from Dumbledore about Harry's safety within the school. Is Harry here? Cornelius asked, looking up towards the ceiling. No, Sirius said sharply, I'll be using this as a base of operations for the Wizengamot, so, no. Our home is elsewhere. It sounds as though you have the boy's safety well in hand, in which case, may I suggest that you allow me a time for us to arrange for you to hear the prophecy at the Dom. Once you learn the exact contents, you may wish to revise your plans, and I'm sure the Minister will all offer any assistance you may need. Bertie suggested. Absolutely. Cornelius agreed obsequiously. Sirius nodded his agreement, hoping that the prophecy contents wouldn't change anything he'd already arranged with Harry. We should also agree what we're going to do about Albus. Bertie said, looking around the room and catching everybody's eye. He is the chief warlock. From an official point of view, if this is a war council, he should be part of these discussions. He motioned at Amelia, who had grimaced. I don't deny he's kept secrets, but we could use his knowledge and expertise going forward. Sirius and I came to the same conclusion. Cornelius said. Sirius sighed and turned to the folder Penelope had placed on a side table in anticipation of the meeting. He extracted the 3 parchments and handed one to each of his visitors. Amelia's eyes widened as she read the invitation. You're adopting Harry tomorrow? Yes, Sirius confirmed, and you're all invited. I'd be delighted, Cornelius said brightly. He looked chuffed to bits, and Sirius knew he was doing an internal dance of glee that he would be present at such a prestigious event. As will I, Bertie said with a smile. It is a long time since I saw family magic in action. May I ask what this has to do with Albus? You want to ensure that Albus can do nothing to challenge your guardianship before he is brought into the council, Amelia stated, motioning with the parchment she held. If the official ministry witnesses are us, it will be difficult for him to argue it isn't valid. Yes, Sirius confirmed baldly, with tomorrow's adoption ritual, I aim to ensure that he won't be able to challenge my guardianship of Harry. Look, he sighed heavily, Dumbledore already knows the things I've shown you. I have no doubt that he has some grand plan in mind for defeating Voldemort, and I'm certain that plan involves Harry. What he needs to understand is that he no longer has a say in what happens to Harry outside of his schooling at Hogwarts, and that there are others now with a plan. He paused. I like our plan. I think our plan is sensible and will work. I believe it is best for Albus Dumbledore to realize these things and help us, but I'm not blind to the fact that unless we have all our ducks in a row, he will find some way of convincing everybody he knows best. You may be right, Bertie began. Maybe, scoffed Cornelius, stabbing a finger in Bertie's direction. He's perfectly right, and you know it. Albus always believes he knows best. I'm prepared to admit that some of the time he does, although perhaps if he shared more than, but it's for the greater good, it would be easier to accept his reasoning. But he's made mistakes, as the past couple of weeks have clearly shown. He was partially responsible for a man not getting a trial, and because of that he left a child, who vanquished the most terrible dark wizard of our time, with abusive and neglectful muggles who hated magic. He's almost gotten the boy killed twice looking at those memories. No, I agree Albus should be a part of our council, but Sirius is quite right. Albus also needs to understand that he will not be leading the fight, and we do not always have to submit to his way of doing things. Amelia was quietly nodding, and Bertie looked at her questioningly. You too, Amelia. I have a lot of respect for Albus Dumbledore, Amelia said firmly, but I cannot deny Cornelius's point or Sirius's. Dumbledore has made mistakes here, especially with Harry. It seems likely to me, given Dumbledore's actions to date, she waved a hand towards the pensive again, that he'll place Harry at the center of any plan. I agree with Sirius that we should not accept any plan that relies upon a 13-year-old boy. Albus may have placed Harry in such a position because of the prophecy, Bertie pointed out. Well, he can bloody well unplace him, Sirius retorted fiercely. Amelia pinned Bertie with a frank stare. Apart from the fact that for the first time I find myself in complete agreement with Cornelius in that I also believe prophecies are a load of hooey, do you honestly believe we would be better served placing the defeat of an evil like Voldemort on the shoulders of a young, inexperienced and partially trained wizard, and sitting around twiddling our thumbs as Dumbledore seems to be doing, rather than the plan we've come up? She pointed at the parchment on the table. No, Bertie sighed, inclining his head, and I happen to agree that it would be best for us to present Albus with a fait accompli. However, I do believe the prophecy has some merit, just as I believe the third memory we witnessed with the prophecy of the servant helping his master has some merit. We may try to keep Harry safe and out of the fight, but prophecies have a way of coming true despite our best intentions. Perhaps Sirius allowed, and I will say that I am ensuring Harry is tutored as much as possible so he has a fighting chance if the worst comes to the worst. I will do as much as possible to ensure that he has every advantage when he faces him. However, I will not have the assumption made that it must be Harry who defeats Voldemort. Bertie nodded. Fair enough. I do have one concern, Sirius, Amelia said, waving her invitation at him, the adoption. You've only spent just over a week with Harry as your ward. I know you want to shut down any avenue Dumbledore has to challenge you, but I'm not convinced it's a good idea to push it through so fast. And I would agree with you if I had spent just over a week with Harry. He held up a hand before she could argue. You remember that you insisted on my getting medical treatment? She nodded warily. You took Harry with you for a week's treatment in a clinic abroad. Yes, Sirius said, we went to the Valley Clinic. It exists in a time bubble. A week passes on the outside and months can pass inside. Harry and I spent 2 months there together. Bertie's expression brightened again. With Noshi Black Hawk. How is he? He's good. Very good and an excellent healer. Harry and I are both back to full health now. Sirius leaned against the mantelpiece and turned back to Amelia. Maybe the adoption is fast, but it's something we both want. Then I'll represent the Wu tomorrow and see that the legal papers are sorted at the same time. Amelia offered. I assume Brian will be attending. He is. Sirius acknowledged. Excellent. Cornelius exclaimed, clapping his hands. Now, Sirius will be attending Thursday's session of the Wizengamot, and afterwards I believe it would be prudent to meet with Albus and inform him of the plans. Why don't we do that Friday morning? Sirius suggested. I think I should probably meet with him alone after the session itself. Suits me. Amelia said, and Bertie nodded in agreement. Very well. Cornelius agreed. Shall we meet weekly for a progress report? We should meet here as we know it is a safe and secure location. Amelia said. If that's all right with you, Sirius. Fine with me. Sirius said. They wrapped up the details and Sirius escorted them back to the flue. Cornelius left first, followed by Bertie, leaving Sirius with Amelia. I should thank you for all you've done. Sirius said, feeling a tad awkward. I wouldn't be here if you hadn't cleared my name. Amelia gave an understanding smile. She reached into her robes and brought out a wand box. I meant to give this to you when I arrived, but, here. She handed him the box with a nod of ceremony. I thought this should be returned to you. Sirius took the box and opened it swiftly, breathing out sharply at the sight of his old wand. He clutched it to him, the warm familiarity of it rushing through his veins like quicksilver. Thank you. Amelia smiled at him. You can thank me by looking after Harry. She paused. I take it the clinic you were at was good for him. For both of us, Sirius repeated, not wanting to give away just how much Harry had required healing. She nodded though, compassion and understanding lighting her eyes. She said a goodbye which he hastily returned before she tossed her flu powder into the fire. Ministry of Magic. She was gone a moment later, leaving Sirius alone in the reception room. He sighed heavily and rubbed his forehead tiredly even as he held his returned wand with glee. The plan was in motion, but there was still a lot to do. Oh. I thought you wanted to wait until the adoption ritual before Harry claimed the black ring. Remus questioned Sirius as he positioned Harry in front of his desk in black manner. Harry stared down at the waiting ritual bowl and small knife with a mixture of trepidation and eagerness. He wanted to do the ritual, but he had to admit that Sirius's comments about the magic being very dark in origin worried him. But I've had a rethink. Sirius said brightly. Cornelius and I both agree it's best to keep Lucius around but neutered, although that's subject to what Lucius admits to tomorrow, but we also think he'll try and stab us in the back at the first opportunity, so I want to make sure the stuff is all done before tomorrow's family meeting so Lucius has no opportunity to interfere with that. Remus sighed and nodded. Should I leave? No, you'll be fine as you're a recognized steward. Sirius assured him. He went to stand beside Harry. You remember what I told you? I remember. Harry said. You'll proclaim me I'll accept, and then the magic tests me. Right. Not to be a killjoy, but that test could take some time and we are expected at the Weasleys. Remus pointed out as he took position on the other side of Harry. You're expected at the Weasleys. Harry and I are unexpected guests accompanying you. He waggled his eyebrows and Harry hid a smile. They'd decided on the subterfuge because the Weasleys seemed very respectful of Dumbledore. They didn't think the Weasleys knew that Dumbledore was in Thailand and why, but Sirius wasn't taking any chances. Thank you. Remus said dryly. So it's only me who'll hear the sharp edge of Molly Weasley's tongue. We have plenty of time before we go to the Weasleys. Sirius contradicted. He waved his hand dismissively. Besides, if this goes anything like his Potter inheritance ritual, we'll be out of here in 30 seconds flat. He grinned at Harry, who rolled his eyes at his godfather. Okay, let's get on with it. Remus ordered. Familius Magicus. Sirius picked up his wand and tapped the ritual bowl. Silver sparkles erupted from the bowl. He cut his palm, allowing the blood to drip into the hollow. I, Sirius Orion Black, head of the House of Black, name Harry James Potter, head of the House of Potter as heir to the House of Black, by blood, by magic, by law, and by this oath. So have I sworn, so mote it be. Harry took the ritual knife and repressed the nerves that were running rampant in his belly. He sliced his palm with a grimace and let the blood drop into the bowl with Sirius's. I, Harry James Potter, head of the House of Potter, accept the duties of heir to the House of Black, by blood, by magic, by law, and by this my oath. So have I sworn, so mote it be. The black magic rose up sharply and surrounded Harry in a silver mist. He could feel it pressing against him, testing him. It was so different to the Potter magic, which had been warm and welcoming. The black magic was cold and icy in comparison. But he remained firm in the center of the silver tempest. He wanted this to work for Sirius because he owed his godfather more than words could say for getting him away from the Dursleys and giving him a home, for loving him. Abruptly the magic left and settled above the ritual bowl in the shape of a silver snake. Harry felt the ring settle on his finger. Harry didn't think, he just opened his mouth. Hello. The snake rose up, its hood flaring. A speaker? Yes. Harry said. Have you had a speaker before? Only one other speaker has come before you, youngling. The snake rippled and twisted. Sirius told me you were a snake, but I didn't realize I would be able to speak to you. Harry said, fascinated by the snake. You are a speaker, and so we can understand each other. Know this, heir of Black, Lord of Potter, you are of our blood and magic, youngling. We will do all that we can to protect you, just as the Griffin of Potter. The snake shifted, glancing towards Sirius, who Harry realized belatedly was looking on with concern. We reunited you once before and always will again when called, remember that, youngling. The snake vanished without another word, and Harry caught his breath as he felt his skin tingle coldly for a long moment, as though the black magic was seeping into him. Harry. Sirius placed a hand carefully on Harry's shoulder. Harry looked up at him and smiled. I'm fine. The snake said it would protect me like the griffin. Ah. Sirius didn't look any less concerned, and Harry wondered why. That's good, isn't it? Harry questioned warily. Sirius and Remus exchanged a look over Harry's head. What? Demanded Harry, annoyed. It's just surprising. Sirius said finally. Family magic isn't supposed to work the way it does for you. I've never heard of the totems being so. He whirled his hand about his head, interactive. Talkative. Cooperative. Protective. All of the above. Oh. Harry frowned. Well, the snake did say it hadn't had the chance to talk with a speaker in a long while, and I would guess the other totems don't have a way of speaking. That's a good point. Remus said. And at least we know you still have your parcel tongue ability. I had wondered if the cleansing of your scar might have, taken it away. Harry nodded slowly. He'd wondered the same thing. I guess I'm stuck with it. I know it isn't the most popular ability to have, Harry Sirius comforted him, but it could prove to be useful in the future. Only if I plan on becoming a snake handler. Harry joked, his tension easing again with the evidence that it didn't matter to Sirius and Remus that he was a Parselmouth. Funny. Remus nudged him, caught sight of the clock and blanched. We should leave. Sirius rolled his eyes but carefully cleaned the bowl and knife before locking them away. Remus hurried them out of the study and towards the flue. Remus went first to warn the Weasleys of the additions to the visit, and Sirius had Harry go next. Harry stumbled out of the flue into the burrow and gave quiet thanks that he hadn't ended up flat on his face. He moved out of the way to allow Sirius room to walk through and was immediately gathered into a hug by Molly Weasley. Harry. She beamed at him as she stepped back, and Harry took the opportunity to step away and stand beside a grinning Ron. It's so good to see you. And don't you look well? You're still a bit skinny though, but no matter, we can feed you up tonight. We weren't expecting dinner, Remus said quickly, and we wouldn't want to put you out. Nonsense. Molly chided him. It's only another couple of mouths to feed. Sirius stepped through with elegant precision, and Harry could see Molly stiffen a tad. Apologies, Sirius said, I had a small delay on the other side. He offered his hand to Molly and she reached out to take his, surprise widening her eyes when he turned her hand over deftly and kissed her knuckles. Madam Weasley. Arthur, who had been standing off to the side, a half-read Daily Prophet tucked under his arm, moved forward. His eyes quickly caught on the crests on Sirius's robes and the ring he wore. "Lord Black. Mr. Weasley." Sirius shook hands solemnly. "Please call me Sirius." "Blimey," Ron muttered under his breath at Harry, "this is all a bit serious." He elbowed Harry and snickered. "Serious? Get it?" Molly shot her youngest son a look that shouted behave. "It's Arthur and Molly." Arthur answered in reply to Sirius's earlier request. He waved around the rest of his brood, which included an older-looking Weasley that Harry hadn't seen before. "My eldest, Bill, Percy, the twins, Fred and George, you know Ron, of course, and finally, Ginny. We're just missing Charlie." They all gave small waves or muttered hellos. "Well, this is an unexpected pleasure," Molly said brightly. "It's so good of Professor Lupin to bring you both." "Please, it's Remus," Remus said quickly. "I've only just broken Harry out of the habit of calling me Professor." "He had to," Harry mused, smiling back at him. "I'm afraid the subterfuge is my fault," Sirius said smoothly, apologizing for their unexpected arrival. "Not many people know Harry's already in my custody, and we're keeping a low profile at the moment until we can make the formal announcements at the Wizengamot." Arthur nodded understandingly. "May we congratulate you both on the guardianship?" Molly looked desperate to say something, but she held her tongue. "Thank you," Harry said proudly. Sirius ruffled his hair and smiled at him affectionately. "We're both very pleased." He sobered a little and motioned at Arthur. "The reason for the visit is there's a bit of business between our various houses that we should discuss. May we make use of your dining table?" Of course. Arthur's gaze sharpened on Sirius's. Molly waved her hands in a shooing motion. "All of you children go and play outside." Sirius placed a hand on Harry's arm to prevent his leaving and cleared his throat. "Harry will be staying, Molly, as both head of the House of Potter and heir to the House of Black, he has to be present." The want to protest was written across Molly's face as prominently as her freckles, but she nodded sharply, conceding in the face of Sirius invoking the house positions. "And as this involves a service Ron has performed for both our houses, you may wish for him to stay," Sirius continued undaunted. "But that is of course at your discretion." His gaze moved from Molly, Arthur. Molly's head snapped around to her husband's with frantic speed. "Arthur, dear." "Ron can stay," Arthur said firmly, "and Bill." His eldest son paused in his bid for the exit. "You should stay as my heir." Arthur gestured toward the table with a succinct head move. It was odd and awkward, Harry thought, as Arthur ushered Sirius, Remus and Harry into seats on one side of the table, grabbing Ron before he could sit next to Harry. The three Weasley males sat opposite and Molly plonked herself down next to Arthur. From the looks exchanged between Arthur and Molly, Harry surmised Molly wasn't supposed to attend but was insisting on being part of the proceedings. Arthur gave in with a sigh. "I have to admit to being surprised," he said to Sirius. "It's been a long time since the Weasleys were openly acknowledged as an ancient and noble house." Sirius shrugged easily. "There's more to house honor than the trappings, Arthur." He gestured at the thinning red head across the table. "You may regain your seat in time if not your title, but that's for discussion another day." Arthur's eyebrows rose up his forehead. "And today's discussion?" "Well, the first bit of business is Harry's." Sirius nudged him gently. Harry cleared his throat nervously. "Mr. Weasley, you and your family have been very kind to me since I came back to the wizarding world, and Ron was my first friend of my own age, so." He took a deep breath. "As, head of the House of Potter, I would be honored if you'd consider an alliance between the House of Weasley and the House of Potter." Ron, who had blushed bright red at Harry's pronouncement of their friendship, beamed at him. Evidently he knew enough about the traditions to know that an alliance was something of immense importance, and to have a house of the status of the Potters request an alliance was a significant honor, especially in light of the House of Weasley's relatively low status. Bill also looked pleased if mildly surprised. Molly looked astounded and she darted a look at her equally stunned husband. "That's..." Arthur started again and cleared his throat. "That's a lovely thought, Harry, but..." Harry's heart sank. Sirius cut in. "We thought the terms should be an alliance of friendship between the houses, Arthur." Because the Weasleys weren't in a political or financial position to agree an alliance of mutual aid and support, having lost their Wizengamot seat years before. Harry believed there wasn't really a difference in the intent of the alliance, just the wording. Arthur's face brightened. Friendship. He looked from Harry to Sirius and back again. Lord Potter, I would be honored to accept such an alliance. How could I not? Ron and Harry grinned at each other. Harry felt Sirius not so subtly nudge him again. Thank you, Mr. Weasley. I think it's probably time to start calling me Arthur, Harry, he said with a smile. He frowned suddenly. I'm afraid I don't think I have our ritual bowl on hand. It's probably somewhere in the family vault. We can complete the alliance ritual another time, Sirius said agreeably. Your word is certainly enough until we can perform it. Molly smiled at Harry. That's a lovely thing you've just done for our family, Harry. Thank you. Harry blushed. Our second piece of business, Sirius said, rescuing him, involves the House of Black. I hope in time that we will also agree an alliance of friendship, but clearly we need to get to know each other a lot better before then. Arthur nodded. Agreed. For now the bit of business we have involves a debt of honor between us, Sirius said. I did get, rather enthusiastic when I went after the rat at Hogwarts, and Ron here did end up getting accidentally injured. Harry watched warily as Molly's expression took on a note of anger. He wondered whether Ron had told her about getting his leg injured or about the night Sirius had ambushed him. According to my solicitor, you were easily within your rights to have me charged with assault, Sirius concluded, keeping his remarks addressed to Arthur. If you had, I would still be on the run. Remus coughed. Or back in Azkaban, allowed Sirius, and Harry would still be at the Dursleys. Harry was pleased to see that mollified Ron's mother a little. In gratitude for your act of kindness and to honor the debt between us, I would like to assume financial responsibility for Ron's education up to and including a mastery if he wishes to pursue one. His tuition fees, his school supplies and a small allowance to be agreed with yourselves would be included, Sirius said. Whoa. Ron muttered, his eyes wide. Remus plucked a parchment from the pocket in his robes and handed it to Arthur. All the details are stated here, Arthur. Well, we couldn't possibly. Molly began. Molly. Arthur's firm use of her name had Molly subsiding. He handed the parchment to Bill. It's a generous offer, but you understand that it isn't necessary, I hope. My decision was made in the same spirit of friendship that is at the heart of the new alliance between the houses of Potter and Weasley. Sirius smiled. Granted, but I'm afraid my house honor demands I repay you, Arthur. I won't take no for an answer. Ron was almost beside him, squirming on the chair beside Bill. He looked anxiously from his father to Sirius and back. Harry could guess at his friend's feelings. Ron was hopeful that the time of always ending up with second-hand clothes and books and everything was at an end. Harry could relate. Arthur sighed. He gestured at his eldest son. What's your view here, Bill? Bill set the parchment down on the table. He had a serious expression on his amiable face. The earring he wore glinted in the late evening sunlight streaming through the window. Everything seems to be in order from a legal point of view, he said. It's a generous offer, but in order for me to know if it satisfies the debt, I'll need to know what exactly happened and how Ron got injured. It's a fair question, Sirius said, stopping Arthur from dismissing his son's query. Let's see, I guess you know the background context of me being innocent, Peter being the traitor hiding out disguised as your family's pet rat. Bill nodded. Well, I guess there are two incidents. The first one, I merely scared Ron by breaking into the dorm and trying to get to the rat there. And the second one, I ambushed him on the Hogwarts grounds while he was carrying the rat and dragged him into a tunnel to the Shrieking Shack, accidentally breaking his leg in the process. You broke my son's leg, Molly yelled loudly. Arthur turned to her with a fierce expression. Molly. Molly glared at her husband and sat back with an angry huff. I was right as rain the next day, honest, Mum, Ron said tentatively. Well, Bill said, with a smile in Ron's direction, I give my blessing to the proposal. I think as Sirius interrupted Ron's education this last year, paying for his future education is an acceptable payment. He paused. but in fairness to the House of Black I think we should only agree on the basis of Ron maintaining acceptable grades. Ron grimaced. I agree, Arthur said. He looked at his youngest son. We don't expect outstandings across the board, but if you fail anything, we shouldn't expect Lord Black to continue paying for you. Bill added the addendum and handed the contract back to Rummus to review. Rummus nodded at Sirius. Sirius conjured a quill and signed the parchment, passing both over to Arthur so he could do the same. Yes, Ron said gleefully. Remember, this agreement is dependent on you getting good grades, Ron, Arthur said. Molly nodded her agreement, her eyes narrowing on Sirius again. At the same time, I'm not sure money can make up for harming a child, she said frostily. Harry inched closer to Sirius, hearing the anger in Molly's voice. I agree with you, Sirius said simply, surprising everyone at the table, although in my defense I wasn't quite sane at the time. 12 years in Azkaban as an innocent man took its toll. Molly had the grace to look discomfort, but the glint in her eye told Harry she hadn't completely given up the fight. And you're sane now? After only a week of healing? Molly, Arthur protested, his face burning as brightly red as his hair. Harry and I spent some time at the Valley Clinic in the States, Sirius informed brusquely. As you may know, it's located in a time bubble. We spent about 2 months there in the week we were gone in normal time. Molly opened her mouth to speak again. However, that's beside the point, Sirius said before she could speak. Regardless of my questionable sanity, I know what I would do to anyone who broke Harry's leg even accidentally, so yes, I agree with you that monetary compensation can't make up for what I did. And knowing that, I assure you the scholarship isn't an apology for that act, it's a thank you for not pressing legal charges so I could take guardianship of my godson. Arthur placed a hand on Molly's arm. I'm grateful that you can appreciate my wife's point of view. As Ron doesn't seem to hold a grudge and it was him that was harmed, I suggest we put it in the past and move on. His gaze rested on his wife's intently. Molly gave a huff and nodded. Sirius inclined his head. Thank you, Ron, Arthur said, turning in his chair to face his son. There's some additional business that I have with the House of Potter that you don't need to stay for, son. You can go and join your brothers and sister outside. Ron looked as though he wanted to protest, but he threw Harry a vaguely apologetic look and pushed his chair away from the table, swiftly departing the house. Harry looked at Arthur confused, wondering what other business they could have to discuss. Arthur sighed and rubbed at his forehead. I had discussed this previously with the headmaster, as at the time there was no regent or steward assigned to represent you, but now you've claimed your ring and have Sirius and Rummus here to advise you. You wish to discuss the life debt your daughter owes Harry, Rummus concluded. Sirius raised an eyebrow questioningly at Rummus as Harry shifted uncomfortably at Arthur's nod of agreement. It wasn't that hard to deduce, Padfoot, Rummus defended quietly. Harry knew from his discussions with Sirius about the life debt Sirius owed Hermione and himself that he couldn't say he didn't care about the life debt he didn't, but it wasn't good form to dismiss it, as it was like saying he didn't care that he'd saved Ginny's life, which was untrue. What life debt? Asked Bill, frowning at his father. Arthur sighed and quickly explained about Ginny's possession, the basilisk in the Chamber of Secrets and the diary. Why didn't anybody tell me? Bill asked, horror written clearly in his blue eyes. Molly glared at him. You were the one who chose to work abroad as a curse breaker, William. You spent most of last summer with me, Mum, I'm sure there was a chance to tell me. Bill rejoined. No wonder Ginny spent so much time quizzing me about possessions. Clearly Arthur broke in as Molly bristled angrily beside him. We should discuss this more in private after our guests have left, but in the meantime, we do have the life debt to settle. Sirius cleared his throat. What did you propose to Albus Dumbledore when you spoke with him? Arthur shook his head. It wasn't so much a proposal as a discussion. I did tentatively suggest that we'd be happy for Harry consider the Burrow a second home and to have him during the summer instead of his going back to his relatives in the Muggle world. Harry could guess where the discussion was going. Let me guess, he shot down the suggestion. Sirius said sarcastically enough to get another disapproving frown from Molly. Albus thought Harry was too young to deal with responsibilities such as life debts. Arthur replied mildly and Molly muttered her agreement, and that Harry was safest at his Muggle relatives. Harry flushed in embarrassment and anger. He felt Sirius's hand on his shoulder, but he stared at the table and took a deep breath. He really didn't want to lose control of his magic. "Well, that was then and this is now," said Rumus soothingly. "Obviously your first suggestion, while a wonderful idea at the time, is no longer needed given recent events. And I'm afraid that is where we come unstuck," Arthur admitted. Ginny is our only daughter and frankly one that was very much wanted. She holds a great deal of value in our eyes. A place in our family would have been equal to that value and paid the debt she incurred, but I'm not entirely certain what else I have to offer beyond the land that comes with the borough or my sworn service to the House of Potter." Molly shifted in her seat, worrying her lower lip as she folded her arms. Harry knew that they could demand the service of Ginny herself. It was her who owed the debt. He had no idea what he was supposed to say. "Or the sworn service of your heir," Sirius said with a thoughtful expression, staring at Bill. Bill sat up straighter, although a hint of worry lurked in his eyes. "If that's what is required, I will fulfill the debt on behalf of Ginny." Harry tapped Sirius on the arm hurriedly and gestured towards the living area. "Can we speak for a moment?" Sirius nodded. "If you'll excuse us, we'll be just a moment." The House of Potter representatives made their way to the front of the sofa and Rumus erected a privacy bubble. "What are you doing?" Harry demanded immediately. "Ron says Bill loves his job. I can't take that away from him." "Of course not," Sirius assured him. "And there are details to be worked out, but it would be very useful to have a goblin-trained curse-breaker for our little treasure hunt." Rumus nodded sagely. "It also gives us someone of our own in Croker's team. Bertie won't be able to refuse because of the life debt angle." Harry frowned. "Okay, so it might be useful, but it's not exactly fair of us to drag him away from his own job. What happens when the treasure hunt is over?" "I should be able to get something arranged at Gringotts, a leave of absence to fulfill a family debt for the period of the treasure hunt, something like that," Sirius assured Harry. "Or how about an exchange of knowledge as part of the treasure hunt?" Rumus suggested. "Bill spends the time learning from the unspeakables get some goblin knowledge. The vows he'll have to take will be difficult but not impossible." He trailed off as he noticed both Sirius and Harry staring at him. "It's a thought." Sirius looked at him skeptically. "I can't see either the goblins or Croker going for it." "Well, we won't know until we've sat all parties down to discuss the matter," Rumus said. "I suggest we get Bill's tentative agreement subject to something being arranged with Gringotts about his ongoing employment." He hesitated for a moment. Thinking about it, do you believe that given a choice Bill will turn down hunting and destroying other objects like the diary that hurt his sister anyway?" "No," Harry answered immediately, "not if he's anything like Ron." They all turned back to glance at the dining table and saw the curious expressions on the faces of the waiting Weasleys. "Okay, new plan," declared Sirius. "We tell Bill about the treasure hunt subject to an oath of confidentiality. We'll offer to help make an arrangement with Gringotts, and if that doesn't happen, once the treasure hunt is over, we'll set Bill up in a new curse-breaking business funded by Potter and Black." Harry nodded slowly. "Okay." They both looked at Rumus. "I agree," Rumus confirmed. He took down the privacy bubble and made their way back to the table. Sirius waited until they were all seated. "Let me start by saying that we are all agreed that if we go with a service arrangement for the life debt, that we will do our utmost to ensure the impact to Bill's career is minimal," he began. Harry was pleased when Bill's eyes brightened with relief, as did Arthur's. "Exactly how we'll do that we don't know as yet, but I'm sure it'll involve a discussion with Gringotts." "What can you say about your employment contract?" Sirius asked. Bill motioned across the table. "Not much, as you would guess, with it being a Gringotts contract. I can tell you that I signed on for 10 years, that mastery in runic warding is part of the deal and I got that 2 years ago, and that there are penalties for non-completion. Beyond that, there are the usual oaths that Gringotts requires of its employees." Sirius said. "So you have 5 years to go and the penalties are financial?" Bill nodded. Molly cleared her throat. "If this is the only way to honor the life debt, the goblins would understand that, wouldn't they?" And Harry realized from the hope in Molly's eyes that service to the House of Potter would mean Bill would be doing something less dangerous and would return to England. They'd probably not press the oath-breaking penalty as a life debt would take higher precedence, Bill informed her, but they would certainly enact the financial penalties. He sighed. I could afford it with what I have saved. Harry stirred uneasily in his chair and looked at Sirius beseechingly. Any penalties would be covered by the House of Potter, Sirius said, catching on immediately, but we will try and arrange a leave of absence so the penalties aren't incurred at all. If you have to leave Gringotts, we'll also ensure your career continues as you wish. Bill's eyes widened in pleased surprise even as his mother's face fell with the assurance that Bill would continue with his wanted profession. Harry guessed Ron's brother had worried that service meant the end of his career. In fact, the reason why I thought of you rather than your father to honor the life debt is that the House of Potter has a project where your talents as a curse breaker would be useful. Sirius continued. We will need a vow of confidentiality before I say anything more and assurances that you practice occlumency. Well, I never. Molly protested. Arthur shot her another pleading look and she subsided. My occlumency is not good, he admitted. If I wore my head of house ring I would be protected, but I've never seen a need to wear it and it's in the vault. I'm goblin trained. Bill said. They don't start teaching you anything of import until you can do occlumency. He smiled at Harry. They like to know their secrets will remain secret. Why don't Bill and I head to another room and I'll inform him of the project? Sirius suggested. If you're happy for only Bill to be privy to the details of the service we require and whether it will satisfy the debt on behalf of the House of Weasley, Arthur. Arthur frowned but nodded. Well, as it mostly will affect Bill, I'll leave the decision to Maya then. Sirius smiled widely. Bill, if you could lead the way. Bill got up and motioned for Sirius to follow him up the stairs. Harry deduced they were going to use a bedroom. Well, I'll start dinner. Molly said brightly, getting up. You will all stay, Remus. I'm afraid not, Molly. Remus said politely. Thank you very much for the invitation, but we're expected home for dinner and Dobby will be anxious if we don't show. Another time, perhaps. Molly frowned heavily but nodded. She headed over to the stove and began banging pots and pans as she assembled them. Arthur cleared his throat, ostensibly ignoring his wife. Harry, has Ron mentioned the Quidditch World Cup? Harry gave a smile and a nod. He said you hoped to get tickets. There's still some finagling to do but we're almost set on that score. You're more than welcome to come with us. Arthur said warmly. We're going to camp there the night before and after so it'll be a real trip. Sirius said he'd talk to you about it. Harry promised. It sounds like fun. So far it's just been a lot of work. Arthur said with a smile. I've had my colleagues at the Department of Magical Games and Sports complaining at me every lunch hour. Is your department involved in the preparation? Remus asked, jumping into the conversation when Harry floundered unsure what to say. Yes, the pitch site is very close to Muggles so we're having to double-check everything. Arthur admitted. Why Bagman decided that place was a good idea, well, I shouldn't criticize really. His assistant Bertha Jorkins was supposed to be back from her holiday and helping by now but she's still away. Bertha? Remus repeated. I haven't heard that name in years. Harry sent him an inquiringly look. She was a few years ahead of us at school. Remus explained. Nice girl but a bit of a gossip and rather flaky. It sounded like Lavender Brown, Harry mused idly. That's Bertha. Arthur said. Ludo's convinced she's just forgotten her return date but I'm not sure she's that dippy. Molly snorted from her position at the stove. Bertha is that dippy, Arthur. She'd forget her own head if it wasn't screwed on. Harry laughed at the comment and Arthur winked and whispered that Molly could be right. Footsteps on the stairs had them all turning back. Bill looked thunderous while Sirius looked calm. They retook their seats. Molly hurried back, evidently determined not to be left out of the discussion. Bill, inquired Arthur tentatively. Harry had a feeling he knew why Bill was so angry, the fact that there were objects like the one that had hurt Ginny lying about, it was horrible and terrifying. I'll gladly perform the service requested for the House of Potter. We have agreed that I will join the project they have in mind in exchange for a salary matching my Gringotts pay and accommodation in London where I'll be based. Bill said tersely. We're also agreed that the House of Potter will do its best to ensure my career doesn't suffer. We'll try and organize a leave of absence, but if Gringotts won't allow that, I'll leave. Sirius has agreed with me that we'll split the penalties 50-50. He held up a hand before anyone could argue. For the record, the importance of the project is such that I'd do it if there was no life debt involved, hence the penalty agreement, but as the House of Potter is insistent. And we are. Sirius added firmly. There we go. Bill said. He looked at his father, who nodded in return. I trust you, William. Arthur said proudly. Then I agree as the heir of the House of Weasley that the House of Potter shall have my service until the task we have discussed is complete to honor the life debt between Ginevra Molly Weasley and Lord Harry James Potter. Sirius nudged Harry. You need to accept. I accept on behalf of the House of Potter, Harry said quickly, knowing he was probably breaking a number of protocol rules. Molly gave a small clap and beamed at her eldest son. Oh, it'll be so good to have you back. And really, Harry, you don't need to include accommodation, Bill will stay here. Harry wondered if Bill was really as horrified as he looked. Sirius cleared his throat. As the Potter Regent, I'm going to have to insist as a point of honor, Molly. Service for the house has always included accommodation and board, and frankly, we have a lot of properties standing vacant. It would be doing us a favor to have one of them occupied and looked after. Molly opened her mouth to argue and Arthur jumped in before she could. Thank you, Sirius, Harry, Arthur said quickly. A young man of Bill's age needs his own space. He patted his son's shoulder. Bill gave a relieved smile and glanced over at Sirius. I'll arrange a meeting with my bosses at Gringotts for next week. He turned to his father, who wore a faintly guilty air. Don't think for a moment I took this under duress, Dad. I'm more than happy to help with the project Sirius has told me about. If there was no debt and I'd found out about it, I would have quit my job and volunteered. His parents were stunned by the admission. Well, Sirius said brightly, one further bit of business is this. He plucked a sheet of parchment from his robes and gave it to Arthur. Your family's invitation to join us for a blessing ritual tomorrow. I know it's short notice, but we hope you can make it. He turned to Harry. Why don't you head outside and spend some time with Ron while Remus and I discuss arrangements with Arthur and Molly? We're done with the official business. Harry nodded, smiled at the Weasleys and made his escape. Ron was hovering just outside the back door, evidently waiting for him, and he quickly dragged him away from the house to the bottom of the garden. They sat down and Harry frowned at the dampness under his palms. Did I hear right? Ron asked excitedly. Is Bill going to work for you? Well, for Sirius, really, Harry pointed out. But, yeah. Ron grinned at him. That's great. Bill's really cool. Not like Percy at all. Harry smiled at Ron and wished he had a brother or a sister. He pushed away the note of jealousy and focused on his friend. I heard you talking about the Quidditch Cup, Ron said. You are going to come, aren't you? It's going to be brilliant. Maybe, Harry prevaricated. I think Sirius will say yes, but he has a lot of lessons planned for me this summer, so. He gave a shrug. He wanted to attend, but he had to admit there was a large part of him that didn't want to spend time away from his godfather. Lessons? Ron said, outraged. What lessons? Stuff to do with my being head of house, etiquette and culture and stuff. Harry said, leaning back and staring up at the sky. Blimey, Ron winced. Rather you than me. Harry took a deep breath. I'm, also taking runes. Professor McGonagall agreed that I could drop divination and take an entry test. Ron stared at Harry as though he'd grown two heads. But that means I'll be on my own. You're abandoning me. I'm sorry, but I can't take another year with Trelawney predicting my death every week. Harry retorted. Besides, you're not on your own, the other guys will still be there, Ron, he pointed out, and if you want, you could do the same and come with me to runes. Sirius won't mind you joining the lessons. Now Ron shook his head. I'm good. He shook his head. I can't believe you're learning all this other stuff though. I need to know it, Harry said, with a touch of annoyance. I didn't realize there was all these traditions and forms of protocol and everything. I have to learn it as the head of the house. Well, as long as you don't turn into Malfoy. Ron said with a strange glint in his eye that told Harry that on one level Ron was deadly serious. Harry gave a bit of a forced laugh and reassured him that was highly unlikely. He wasn't surprised when Ron turned the conversation to Quidditch. He gave a quiet sigh of relief as he listened, pleased with Ron's relatively easy acceptance of his new position and his decision about runes. Sure, there had been a tense moment but they had gotten past it. Harry ignored a lingering flicker of worry that Ron would have issues with Harry gaining a little independence and focused on Ron's rant about the Cannon's new signings. The polite knock at the door to the formal parlor had Sirius pausing mid-sentence with a muttered apology to Miriam Granger and calling out for Penelope to enter. Her blonde hair was braided into some complicated female thing Sirius had never worked out and she was dressed in formal robes bearing the Black and Potter crests. She smiled cheerfully. "The Tonks and the Malfoys are both awaiting your presence in your study, Lord Black." "Right." Sirius grimaced. It had already been a long morning in some respects. He'd performed the judgment ritual on the Lestranges in anticipation of the family meeting as soon as he had flew to Black Manor that morning. He had discussed it with Harry the night before and his godson had been appropriately attentive, understanding the gravity of the decisions that Sirius had made. It would serve as his politics lesson for the week. Sirius wouldn't allow him to witness the ritual though or take part as the heir as he had known the likelihood of the Lestranges surviving judgment was small and he didn't want Harry involved with what was in reality an execution. Harry and Remus had instead collected the Grangers in anticipation of meeting the Tonks once Sirius had accepted them back into the House of Black. Miriam and Wallace wore good quality if plain Muggle clothing while Hermione had formal dress robes in a deep mauve color that suited her coloring. Minerva had since arrived too and had been delighted to be reintroduced to Hermione's parents, presenting them with a long-wished-for apology about the various school incidents that helped smooth everything over. They had all settled in the formal parlor for morning tea. "Showtime," Remus pointed out briskly with a grin that Sirius remembered from their Marauder days. "Good luck," Harry said with a cheeky grin all of his own. Sirius had learned the subtle differences that separated Harry's features and expressions from James's or even Lily's. Sirius gave him a wink, set his tea down and got to his feet. He headed out of the door and down the corridor. If it hadn't been for the Malfoys he would have had Harry with him as his heir but he'd talked it over with him and they'd decided it was too risky. Draco and Harry were likely to set each other off and Sirius didn't trust Lucius not to try and murder Harry in front of him no matter what protections the manor had for its heir. He stopped in front of the study door and took a deep breath. He opened the door, strode into the room and closed the door behind him with a sharp bang that caught the attention of his waiting cousins and their families. He was amused to note that they were politely ignoring each other in the seating area. The Tonks sat to the far right and the Malfoys closer to the door. Sirius ignored Narcissa's paling face and Lucius's dark look to walk forward and stand in front of his desk. "Hello, members of the House of Black," Sirius said formally. "Thank you for answering the summons to the family meeting." Andy and Ted gave tentative smiles while their daughter grinned at him happily. The Malfoys were a mix of disinterest, Draco, horror, Narcissa, and glowering anger. "Lucius, you're Lord Black?" Lucius questioned furiously. Sirius held up his hand and displayed the ring. "And you're a prat and now we've established that perhaps we can get to business." He heard a badly hidden snicker from Nymphadora Tonks. Draco bristled. "Father, are you?" Narcissa put a hand on his arm and silenced him with a look. "My apologies, Lord Black, my husband and son are simply surprised. We had believed the new Lord Black came from the line of Marius Black." He could see the wheels turning in her eyes as she recalculated what was going to happen. "Simeon," Sirius offered with a toothy smile. "Well, in that case you will be pleased to know that in the event of my unfortunate demise Simeon will take on the mantle of Regent of the House of Black until my heir is of age. Simeon sends his apologies but he will be in the country later in the summer and will meet up with you all then. He and I have, via correspondence, discussed our new agenda, the decisions that I've made and will make today and are in agreement." The shocked looks on their faces was priceless. "Well, that deals with one of my announcements," Sirius said jauntily. "Let's see, second announcement, Lord Harry James Potter is my confirmed heir by blood, by magic, by oath and by law. He wears the ring. He sends his apologies but he is hosting our other guests for today's later events." Draco was instantly outraged, his nostrils were flaring, cheeks bright red. Sirius wondered if he was about to see someone combust without the use of flammables. He'd have to show Harry the memory later in a pensive, Sirius mused. By blood. Narcissa challenged haughtily. Sirius raised an eyebrow. I thought you of all people with your love of genealogy would have remembered that Harry's grandmother was a black, Narcissa, Doria Black to be exact. He smiled again. I'm also going to be adopting him later today. Frankly, the family magic loves him. You remember the totem is a snake. Apparently it can talk to Harry, they get on like a house on fire. Lucius's lips thinned to almost nothing, as did Narcissa's. Sirius began to pace. Now, to other business. I did think about telling you what our new political agenda will be, he said, gesticulating vaguely, but I decided actions speak louder than words. So? He stopped and regarded them solemnly. I have been reviewing our family's actions. Let me start with the Lestranges. Our motto was and is 2 years per always pure. It wasn't always about blood, no matter what my mad mother might have thought, it was always about the house of